My billionaire grandfather disowned me for marrying a poor man. He took the microphone at my own wedding reception and declared to a room full of guests that I was getting no inheritance, nothing at all. As the crowd gasped, my husband simply smiled, held my hand, and told him we did not need a single dime of his money. 3 months later, my grandparents were left completely speechless when they discovered which company my husband actually owned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your true worth. My name is Kiara and I am 29 years old. Growing up in a prominent African-American family in Atlanta, Georgia, the Sterling name carried a weight that felt more like a shackle than a privilege. My grandfather, Reginald Sterling, built Sterling Tech from the ground up, turning it into one of the largest consumer technology empires in the country. To the world, he was a visionary leader and a philanthropist. To me, he was a ruthless dictator who measured human value entirely by bank account balances and social pedigree. While my younger sister Chloe was groomed for high society, paraded around at galas, and treated like the golden child, I was the family workhorse. I did not care about designer dresses or country club memberships. I cared about how things worked. I became a supply chain consultant and operations specialist, spending my days in steel-toed boots on factory floors. I optimized production line operations and overhauled electronic component manufacturing processes. I understood the intricate dance of motherboard assembly equipment maintenance and quality control. I worked twice as hard as anyone else just to get a fraction of my grandfather's approval, but it was never enough. The final straw for my family was DeAndre. I met him when he was working logistics coordinating freight deliveries for one of our manufacturing hubs. He was 32, incredibly smart, hardworking, and grounded. He wore steel-toed boots and high-visibility vests, completely unimpressed by the Sterling wealth. I fell in love with his brilliant mind and steady heart. When I brought him home to meet my family, the judgment was suffocating. My grandmother Beatrice scrutinized his unbranded watch and calloused hands, while Reginald interrogated him about his pedigree. When DeAndre politely explained he managed warehouse logistics, my family mentally discarded him. Despite their disapproval, DeAndre and I planned a modest, elegant wedding at a botanical garden just outside the city. We paid for it ourselves, wanting a day filled with genuine love rather than corporate networking. We invited my family, hoping they would set aside their elitist views for one afternoon to celebrate my happiness. That was a foolish hope. The reception was in full swing. The jazz band was playing a smooth melody, and DeAndre and I had just finished our first dance. I was wearing a simple silk gown, and DeAndre looked impossibly handsome in his rented tuxedo. I felt a brief moment of pure joy, believing that maybe, just maybe, everything would be all right. Then the sharp, piercing sound of a fork striking crystal shattered the warm atmosphere. The music abruptly stopped. Conversations died in an instant. I turned toward the head table to see my grandfather Reginald standing up, his face a mask of cold fury. He snatched the microphone from the wedding coordinator, his knuckles white as he gripped it. The entire garden fell dead silent. I thought he was going to offer a traditional, albeit stiff, toast. Instead, he looked directly at DeAndre with a sneer that made my blood run cold. "I have built an empire on excellence." Reginald's voice boomed through the speakers, echoing off the glass walls of the conservatory. The Sterling name represents power, elite status, and unwavering standards. Yet today, I am forced to watch my eldest granddaughter drag our legacy through the mud by chaining herself to a blue-collar nobody. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd of guests. My stomach plummeted to the floor. I stepped forward, reaching for DeAndre's hand, but my grandfather raised his voice even louder. "Look at him," Reginald sneered, pointing a manicured finger at my husband. "A freeloader in a rented suit, a warehouse boy hoping to strike gold by marrying a Sterling. You thought you hit the jackpot, didn't you, son? You thought you could coast through life on my hard work." "Grandpa, stop it right now," I shouted, my voice trembling with a mix of humiliation and absolute rage. "You are ruining my wedding." You ruined your own life, Kiara, Reginald shot back, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. I warned you. I told you that if you proceeded with this pathetic union, there would be consequences. You chose to marry a man who brings nothing to the table. Therefore, you will receive exactly what he brings, nothing. He paused, letting the heavy silence amplify his cruelty. Effective immediately, Kiara is completely disinherited. She will not see a single dime of the Sterling fortune. You are cut off. You wanted the working class experience, Kiara. Congratulations, you have it. He slammed the microphone down onto the table with a deafening thud. My grandmother Beatrice sat next to him, sipping her champagne without a shred of empathy on her face. From the adjacent table, my brother-in-law Terence let out a loud, mocking laugh. Terence was the vice president of procurement at Sterling Tech, a title he earned solely by marrying my sister Chloe. He stood up, lifting his glass of expensive whiskey. A toast! Terence called out, his voice dripping with condescension. To Kiara and her new life of clipping coupons and riding the bus. May your love keep you warm when they shut the power off. Chloe giggled, leaning into Terence's shoulder. Honestly, Kiara, we tried to save you. But if you want to play house with a delivery boy, do not expect us to fund your charity case. Good luck buying your clothes at discount racks from now on. The sheer audacity of their mockery ignited a fire inside me. I let go of DeAndre's hand and marched right up to Terence's table, my wedding dress trailing behind me. I did not care who was watching. You have a lot of nerve talking about funding anything, Terence, I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent garden. Let us talk about your so-called brilliant executive skills. Last quarter, Sterling Tech was bleeding cash on the assembly floor because your procurement strategy was a total disaster. The electronic component manufacturing was failing, the motherboards were frying on the line, and equipment maintenance was non-existent. The company was going to lose $40 million. Terence's smug smile faltered his face, flushing angrily as the nearby guests began to whisper. I was the one who went down to the production line. I continued, stepping closer. I was the one who optimized the robotic soldering profiles. I restructured the entire component supply chain and fixed the hardware bottlenecks. I saved this family $40 million in a single month, and you took the credit for it in the boardroom because you did not want Grandpa to know a woman had to do your job. You are the real freeloader here, Terence. You are just wearing a much more expensive suit. Terence opened his mouth to shout back, but Reginald slammed his hand on the table. Enough of this insolence, Reginald roared. You will not speak to executives of my company this way. You are a disgrace, Kiara. You have made your bed with this peasant and now you will lie in it. Do not ever come crawling back to me when you realize love does not pay the mortgage. My chest heaved as I stared at the man who shared my blood, but possessed none of my heart. I was preparing to tell him exactly where he could shove his company, but I felt a warm, steady hand on my shoulder. It was DeAndre. He stepped in front of me, perfectly calm, his posture relaxed despite the verbal assault he had just endured. He picked up the microphone from the table. Mr. Sterling, DeAndre said, his deep voice carrying a quiet authority that instantly commanded the room. He did not sound angry, he sounded almost amused. Thank you for the clarity, but you misunderstand something fundamental. I did not marry Kiara for your wealth. I married her because she is brilliant, fiercely loyal, and worth more than any corporate asset you possess. DeAndre set the microphone back down gently and looked at my grandfather with a pitying smile. Keep your money, Reginald. We do not need it. We build our own empires. He turned to me, offering his arm. Ready to go, Mrs. Vance? More than ready, I said, taking his arm. We turned our backs on my family and walked out of the garden together. The guests parted for us like the Red Sea. I kept my head held high, refusing to let them see me shed a single tear. I felt a surge of adrenaline and liberation. I was finally free from the toxic expectations and the constant belittling. We were going to build our own life far away from the Sterling Tech toxicity. We reached the gravel driveway where our decorated getaway car was waiting. The cool evening air felt refreshing against my heated skin. DeAndre opened the passenger door for me, his eyes full of nothing but pride and unconditional love. I smiled at him, feeling incredibly lucky to have a man who would stand by me with such quiet strength. I slid into the leather seat, letting out a long, heavy exhale. I reached into my small bridle clutch to grab my phone, wanting to turn it off so we could enjoy the rest of our night in peace. As my fingers brushed the screen, the phone violently vibrated in my hand. Then it vibrated again, and again. I pulled the phone out, frowning at the sudden barrage of notifications. They were all urgent alerts from my banking app. I unlocked the screen, my eyes scanning the text. My heart stopped dead in my chest. Every single account linked to my name showed a balance of 0, my checking account, my personal savings, the emergency fund I had built from my consulting bonuses, even the restricted trust fund my late mother had left me, which Reginald was supposedly just managing until I turned 30. Everything was gone. The accounts were frozen, drained, and locked out by the primary guarantor. My grandfather had not just cut me out of his will, he had illegally seized every dollar I had ever earned. I stared at the glowing screen, the words blurring together as panic seized my throat. I had exactly $0 to my name, and my honeymoon started tomorrow. DeAndre got into the driver's seat and smiled at me, completely unaware of the digital bomb that had just detonated in my hands. "To our new life," he said softly, putting the car in gear. I swallowed hard, clutching the phone until my knuckles turned white. The car rolled down the long, winding driveway of the botanical garden, leaving the flashing lights and the cruel laughter of my family behind. I looked down at the banking alerts again, my mind racing through the legalities and the sheer vindictiveness of Reginald's actions. He had always warned me that defying him would be costly, but I never imagined he would stoop to outright financial theft. The mother's trust fund was legally mine, yet he had manipulated the corporate lawyers to lock me out. He wanted to break me. He wanted me to crawl back on my hands and knees, begging for my old job back, begging for a place at his table. I looked over at DeAndre, his strong profile illuminated by the passing streetlights. He thought we were just starting from 0. He did not know we were actually starting from below 0. But as I watched him drive, completely unbothered by the billionaires who had just mocked him, a strange sense of resolve washed over me. Reginald Sterling thought he had severed my lifeline. He thought removing my access to wealth would strip away my power. But he forgot one crucial detail. I was the one who knew how the machines worked. I knew the production lines. I knew the suppliers. I knew the exact breaking points of his beloved electronic component manufacturing empire. If he wanted a war of attrition, he had chosen the wrong opponent. I turned my phone completely off, dropping it back into my clutch. The battle would begin tomorrow. Tonight I was just a woman driving away with the man she loved. The flight to Bora Bora was supposed to be our sanctuary, away from the suffocating grip of the Sterling family empire. As DeAndre and I stepped off the private water taxi and onto the pristine wooden docks of the St. Regis, the warm, tropical breeze carried the scent of hibiscus and salt. It felt like a true beginning. We walked hand in hand into the open-air lobby, the turquoise water glittering beneath the glass floors. The concierge greeted us with a flawless smile, presenting a silver tray with cool lavender-scented towels. I handed over my premium platinum credit card to cover the incidental deposit and the remaining balance of our overwater bungalow. I was still riding the high of our defiant exit from the botanical garden. The concierge slid the card into the sleek terminal. A sharp, discordant beep broke the tranquil atmosphere of the lobby. The concierge frowned slightly, tapping the screen before swiping the card a second time. Another harsh beep echoed across the marble counter. He looked up, his smile tightly maintained, but his eyes betraying a hint of professional discomfort. He informed me that the transaction had been declined. A cold prickle of unease ran down the back of my neck. I quickly reached into my bridle clutch and pulled out my secondary card, the one tied directly to the payroll account where I received my hefty consulting bonuses. I slid it across the counter with a reassuring nod to DeAndre, who stood patiently beside me with our luggage. The machine beeped again. Declined. The blood drained from my face. I stepped away from the counter, apologizing to the concierge, and pulled out my phone. My thumbs flew across the screen as I bypassed the biometric security on my banking application. The dashboard loaded, and the breath was instantly knocked out of my lungs. My checking account, which held the funds for our daily expenses, displayed a balance of 0. My high-yield savings account, the safety net I had painstakingly built over years of grueling 80-hour workweeks, optimizing assembly lines, showed a balance of 0. My hands began to shake as I navigated to the secure portal holding the irrevocable trust left by my late mother. It was designed specifically with ironclad legal protections to prevent Reginald from ever touching it. The screen flashed a bright crimson error banner. The account was locked frozen pending a court-ordered investigation. Reginald had not just cut me out of his will in a fit of rage at the wedding. He had executed a highly coordinated, premeditated financial guillotine strike while we were thousands of miles up in the air. My phone vibrated violently in my palm, nearly causing me to drop it onto the glass floor. The caller ID displayed a private number, but I knew exactly who it was. I swiped to answer and pressed the phone to my ear. The smooth, icy voice of my grandmother Beatrice flowed through the speaker. She did not bother with a greeting. She simply noted that I must have reached the front desk by now. I demanded to know how Reginald had bypassed the legal protections on my mother's trust. Beatrice let out a soft, condescending chuckle that made my stomach churn. She explained that Reginald's corporate lawyers had filed an emergency injunction at dawn. They submitted a motion claiming I was suffering from a severe psychological break, using my sudden marriage to a destitute warehouse laborer as primary evidence of my mental incompetence. A sympathetic judge, heavily backed by Sterling Tech campaign contributions, had signed the order to freeze all my assets, pending a full competency hearing. Beatrice did not call to gloat, however. She called to offer an ultimatum. Her tone sharpened, slicing through the tropical air like a scalpel. She informed me that Reginald had just emailed a set of annulment papers to my secure server. The terms were brutally simple. I was to sign the papers immediately, leave the warehouse boy at the resort, and fly back to Atlanta alone. If I complied, the injunction would be lifted and my accounts would be fully restored before my plane touched down on the tarmac. She advised me to stop playing this ridiculous game of working-class rebellion and come home to my rightful place. I looked over at DeAndre. He was standing near a massive pillar of carved mahogany, quietly admiring the intricate woodwork, completely unbothered by the opulent wealth surrounding him. His calm, steady presence was the exact opposite of the chaotic, status-obsessed world I had grown up in. I gripped the phone tighter and told my grandmother that I would rather drown in the Pacific Ocean than sign a single document Reginald put in front of me. I ended the call and permanently blocked her number. I refused to let this orchestrated humiliation break me. I refused to let DeAndre watch me panic over money. I took a deep breath, forcing my racing heart to slow down, and shifted my mindset from a terrified bride to a seasoned supply chain consultant. I needed immediate liquidity, and I needed to leverage my available physical assets. I looked down at the luggage cart holding my custom-made, limited edition Hermes trunk set. I had purchased the vintage set as a graduation gift to myself years ago. I knew that luxury resorts of this caliber often featured discreet, high-end consignment and appraisal boutiques off the main promenade, catering to wealthy guests who wanted to acquire rare items or liquidate assets quietly. I told DeAndre to give me 5 minutes and marched straight toward the shopping arcade. I found a boutique dealing in vintage luxury goods and walked inside, pulling my trunks behind me. The appraiser behind the counter looked skeptical until I began detailing the exact specifications of the luggage. I did not act like a desperate tourist. I operated like a ruthless negotiator. I pointed out the flawless stitching, the rare Togo leather, and the pristine, museum-quality condition of the hardware. I treated the negotiation exactly like a tense supplier meeting on a factory floor. Within 15 minutes, I had extracted a certified cashier's check from the boutique owner that not only covered the remaining balance of our honeymoon suite, but left a comfortable margin for our daily expenses. I dumped my carefully folded vacation clothes into 2 complimentary canvas resort bags provided by the boutique owner and walked out, leaving the luxury trunks behind without a second thought. While I was in the back room finalizing the paperwork, DeAndre had approached the main concierge desk. He did not look panicked, embarrassed, or out of place. He moved with a quiet, lethal grace. He reached into the inner pocket of his rented tuxedo jacket and slid a heavy matte black card across the polished marble counter. The card was entirely devoid of any bank logo's numbers or identifying marks. It was a solid slab of anodized metal representing a highly restricted tier of financial power reserved for a microscopic fraction of global elites. He leaned forward and quietly instructed the concierge to charge the entire stay, all meals, all excursions, and any incidentals to that card. He specifically ordered the concierge to remain silent and to inform his wife that the resort had offered them a complimentary VIP upgrade for their honeymoon. The concierge stared at the heavy black card, his eyes widening as he recognized the sheer weight of the financial instrument sitting on his desk. He reached out to take it, opening his mouth to assure DeAndre that discretion was their highest priority. Before his fingers could even brush the cool metal, the boutique doors swung open. I marched out into the lobby, waving the cashier's check with a fierce, triumphant grin. DeAndre's reflexes were lightning fast. With a fluid, almost imperceptible motion, he palmed the solid black card and slid it seamlessly back into his jacket pocket. By the time I reached the desk, his face had shifted instantly into an expression of supportive awe. He listened attentively as I proudly slapped the cashier's check onto the counter and paid for our suite in full. He let me have the victory because he understood that my pride and my self-reliance were the only armor I had left. We spent the next week in paradise, completely disconnected from the toxic fallout waiting for us back in Atlanta. We swam in the coral reefs, ate fresh seafood on our private deck, and talked about our future. We promised each other that we would build a life based on mutual respect, far away from the manipulative games of the Sterling Empire. But the reality of our situation hovered at the edges of my mind. I had no savings, no trust fund, and a family that was actively trying to destroy me. As our honeymoon came to an end, we boarded the long flight back to the mainland. We settled into our cramped economy seats, a stark contrast to the private jets I had grown up flying on, but I felt content resting my head against DeAndre's shoulder. Halfway through the flight, the captain announced that we had reached cruising altitude and the in-flight wireless network was available. I decided to log in and check my work email, hoping to get a head start on the upcoming week. I was a senior consultant at a prestigious logistics firm, and I was managing a highly sensitive contract restructuring for a major automotive manufacturer. I needed to ensure my team had not encountered any bottlenecks while I was away. I purchased a Wi-Fi pass and opened my email application. The inbox refreshed, pulling down dozens of new messages. A single email sat at the very top of my priority inbox, flagged with high importance. The sender was the managing partner of my consulting firm, a man who had personally recruited me and praised my relentless work ethic just last month. The subject line consisted of 4 words that made the blood freeze in my veins. Immediate termination of contract. I tapped the email, my hands suddenly clammy in the dry cabin air. The message was brief, legally sterile, and devoid of any warmth. It stated that due to unforeseen circumstances and pressure from their largest corporate clients, the firm was terminating my employment effective immediately. They instructed me to return my company laptop via courier and barred me from stepping foot on the premises. I stared at the glowing screen, the mechanical hum of the jet engines fading into a dull roar in my ears. Reginald had not stopped at stealing my money. He had deployed his ultimate weapon. He had blacklisted me. The plane touched down in Atlanta with a heavy thud mirroring the weight dropping in my stomach. DeAndre squeezed my hand, noticing the rigid tension in my posture. I quickly locked my phone screen, pasting on a reassuring smile. I told him it was just a turbulent landing, masking the reality that my entire professional identity had just been erased with a single keystroke. The email from my managing partner echoed in my mind on an endless, agonizing loop. Immediate termination. They did not even have the courtesy to call the woman who had personally salvaged their largest automotive account. Reginald was moving faster than I had anticipated. He wanted me broken, destitute, and crawling back to the Sterling estate before my honeymoon tan even faded. I refused to give him the satisfaction. I told DeAndre I needed to drop by the office immediately to handle a minor contract discrepancy. He offered to come up with me, but I insisted he wait in the car. I needed to face this alone. I needed to look my managing partner in the eye and force him to admit that he had caved to my grandfather's extortion. The glass doors of the logistics firm stood tall and imposing, reflecting the bleak, overcast Atlanta sky. I pushed through the revolving entrance, my heels clicking against the polished marble floor with a determined rhythm. The atmosphere in the lobby was instantly suffocating. The usual morning buzz felt muted. The receptionist, a woman who usually greeted me with bright enthusiasm, immediately dropped her gaze to her keyboard. She picked up her desk phone, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper. Before I could even reach the security turnstiles, two heavy-set security guards stepped directly into my path. Their faces were stony, devoid of the friendly recognition we had shared just weeks ago. They crossed their arms, physically blocking the glass gates. I kept my chin raised and demanded to know what was going on. I stated that I needed to retrieve my personal belongings and my physical project files. The senior guard shifted uncomfortably, pulling a printed memo from his breast pocket. He informed me that my building access had been permanently revoked. He stated he had strict orders to escort me directly to my office, monitor my packing, and ensure I was off the premises within 15 minutes. The sheer scale of Reginald's power play began to crystallize in my mind. He had not just fired me, he had orchestrated a public execution of my career. I did not argue with the guards. I nodded sharply and allowed them to flank me as we entered the elevator. The ride up to the executive floor was agonizingly silent. When the door slid open, the entire logistics floor resembled a morgue. Analysts and junior consultants I had personally mentored suddenly found their spreadsheets incredibly fascinating. No one looked up. No one offered a word of sympathy. They all knew the unwritten rule of the corporate tech sector. You do not cross Reginald Sterling. My grandfather had clearly issued a terrifying ultimatum. Any firm that employed Kiara Vance would immediately and permanently lose every single Sterling Tech logistics and supply chain contract. In this industry, losing the Sterling account meant bankruptcy. Reginald had essentially mandated a sector-wide blacklist. I was radioactive. I marched down the long corridor toward my corner office, determined to grab my custom supply chain optimization matrices and leave with my dignity intact. But as I rounded the corner, my blood boiled instantly. My office door was wide open. Sitting behind my custom oak desk, leaning back in my ergonomic chair with his expensive Italian leather shoes propped carelessly right on top of my family photographs, was my brother-in-law, Terrence. He was sipping a macchiato, looking around my meticulously organized office with an expression of supreme boredom. He wore a smug, punchable smirk that made my hands curl into fists. He had absolutely no business being in this building, let alone in my private workspace. I stepped into the room, ignoring the two security guards hovering awkwardly in the doorway. I demanded to know what he was doing in my chair. Terrence chuckled, taking a slow, agonizing sip of his coffee. He swung his legs off my desk and leaned forward, resting his elbows on my quarterly projection reports. He looked at me with eyes full of malicious delight. He said he was just doing a favor for the family. He claimed Reginald wanted to ensure the firm handled my termination with the appropriate level of urgency. Terrence boasted that he had personally driven over to hand-deliver the new, highly lucrative logistics contract my former bosses had secured in exchange for throwing me out on the street. The depth of their corruption was staggering. My grandfather was literally bribing companies to ruin my life. Terrence stood up, smoothing his tailored suit jacket. He walked around the desk, invading my personal space. He looked me up and down, his gaze dripping with unfiltered condescension. He mocked my thrifted dress and asked how the budget honeymoon was. He said Chloe was currently shopping in Paris, spending more in an hour than my new husband made in a decade. I did not flinch. I kept my voice dangerously low and steady. I told him to get out of my office so I could pack my things. Terrence laughed again, a harsh grating sound. He said I did not need to pack anything because everything in the office, including the optimization matrices I had built from scratch, now legally belonged to the firm. And since the firm was essentially in Reginald's pocket, my intellectual property now belonged to Sterling Tech. They had stolen my money, my job, and now my life's work. But Terrence was not finished. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, tossing it onto the desk. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale espresso and arrogance. He stated that Reginald was not entirely heartless. He said the family was willing to offer me a lifeline, a way to keep a meager paycheck coming in, so my warehouse husband would not have to work triple shifts just to feed me. Terrence smirked and officially offered me a job. He wanted me to be his personal coffee runner. He proposed that I could fetch his morning lattes, pick up his dry cleaning, and maybe if I behaved, he would let me wipe down the whiteboards after his executive meetings. He said it was the perfect role for someone who had thrown away a billion-dollar legacy for a man who drove a forklift. A heavy, deafening silence fell over the office. The security guards in the doorway shifted nervously, sensing the explosive tension radiating from where I stood. I looked at the piece of paper on the desk. Then I looked at Terrence's brand new limited edition designer briefcase resting on the visitor's chair. It was left unzipped, showcasing a stack of highly sensitive Sterling Tech contracts and his prized custom-ordered tablet. I picked up the half-full cup of coffee Terrence had left on my desk. It was still piping hot. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply walked over to his chair, tipped the cup forward, and dumped the scalding sticky liquid directly into the open briefcase. The dark coffee splashed violently over his pristine documents, soaking the contracts and pooling heavily around the expensive electronics of his tablet. The screen sputtered, flashed bright white, and immediately went black with a pathetic fizzle. Terrence let out a high-pitched, panicked shriek. He lunged forward, desperately clawing at the ruined leather and the soaked, unsalvageable papers. His smug demeanor vanished entirely, replaced by absolute, unadulterated horror. He screamed that I was insane, that the tablet contained the only unbacked copies of the new supplier agreements. I dropped the empty coffee cup onto the floor. It hit the carpet with a dull thud. I stepped right up to his panicked face, my voice cutting through the room like a serrated blade. I told him I would rather scrub public restroom floors with a toothbrush than spend a single second working for a pathetic, incompetent fraud. I pointed at the ruined briefcase. I told him he was panicking over wet paper while his entire department was actually burning to the ground. I reminded him that he did not even understand the most basic fundamentals of production line operations. I told him he could not differentiate between a standard silicon wafer and a high-density multi-layered motherboard if his life depended on it. I leaned in closer, making sure every single word etched itself into his arrogant brain. I stated that while he was busy acting like a powerful executive, he was completely oblivious to the massive hardware bottlenecks forming in his own supply chain. I told him he was driving Sterling Tech straight off a cliff, and Reginald was too blind to see that he had handed the keys to a clown. Terrence was shaking his hands, dripping with coffee, his face purple with rage. He ordered the security guards to arrest me for property damage. I did not wait for the guards to move. I grabbed my purse and turned my back on him. I told the guards I was leaving and I set the pace. I strode out of the office, my head held incredibly high, leaving Terrence sputtering and cursing over his ruined designer bag. The walk back through the logistics floor felt entirely different. I was jobless, blacklisted, and financially drained, but I was not broken. The stares of my former colleagues no longer felt like pity. They felt like awe. I had just declared war on the most powerful family in the city, and I had done it without shedding a single tear. I rode the elevator down in total silence, the security guards standing respectfully at a distance. When the doors opened to the lobby, I walked out of the building and into the brisk morning air. The heavy glass doors sealed shut behind me, severing my ties to the corporate world that had just betrayed me. I scanned the street and spotted our modest second-hand sedan parked by the curb. DeAndre was leaning against the passenger door, his arms crossed over his chest, his strong frame relaxed but alert. He wore his standard work boots and a plain t-shirt, looking completely out of place among the luxury vehicles lining the financial district, yet he commanded the space effortlessly. He saw me walking toward him. He did not ask how the meeting went. He took one look at the fierce, unyielding expression on my face and knew exactly what had transpired. He knew the Sterling family had pulled the trigger. I walked up to him, stopping inches away from his chest. I looked up into his deep, steady eyes. I told him I was officially unemployed and entirely blacklisted from the industry. I told him they took everything. DeAndre did not flinch. He did not look worried. He simply reached out his thumb, gently tracing the line of my jaw. He pulled me into a brief, grounding embrace, his heartbeat steady and calming against my cheek. When he pulled back, he reached into his pocket and retrieved his phone. The screen was illuminated, displaying a highly encrypted messaging application. He turned the screen toward me. His eyes were dark, calculating, and dangerously sharp. He told me not to worry about Reginald's little blacklist. He said the entire tech industry was about to experience a massive, unprecedented crisis. I looked at the message on his phone. It was an urgent alert from an overseas manufacturing hub regarding a catastrophic disruption in rare earth mineral processing. A massive, impending industry shortage was about to hit the electronic component market. DeAndre locked the phone and opened my car door. He smiled, a fierce, protective glint in his eyes. He said the Sterling Empire was about to run out of supplies and we were going to be the ones holding the only remaining lifeline. The reality of our new situation set in the moment DeAndre turned the key in the lock of our new apartment. We had traded the pristine, manicured streets of the corporate district for a cramped third-floor walk-up in the industrial sector of the city. The hallway smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and old floor wax. The overhead fluorescent light flickered with a dull, incessant hum, casting long, harsh shadows against peeling wallpaper. We stepped inside, and I took a long look at our new home. The living room was barely large enough to hold a sofa and a small television. The kitchen consisted of a scratched Formica countertop, a stove with one missing dial, and a refrigerator that hummed louder than the hallway lights. Water stains bloomed across the ceiling like dark, ominous clouds. It was a poverty trap, the exact kind of suffocating, dead-end environment my grandfather Reginald had intended to bury me in. He wanted the physical reality of this space to break my spirit. He wanted the chipped paint and the rattling radiator to remind me every single second of what I had given up. DeAndre set down the 2 canvas bags containing the only clothes I currently owned. He did not complain. He did not look around with disgust or regret. He simply rolled up his sleeves, walked over to the single window overlooking the alleyway, and forced it open to let in a breeze of humid city air. He turned to me with a reassuring smile, a silent promise that this was merely a temporary staging ground, not our final destination. I took a deep breath, letting the heavy, stagnant air fill my lungs. I was stripped of my title, my wealth, and my legacy, but my mind was sharper than ever. I began to unpack, organizing our meager belongings with the same ruthless efficiency I used to streamline manufacturing floors. We had barely been in the apartment for 48 hours when the obnoxious, deafening roar of a high-performance engine shattered the Sunday afternoon quiet. I was at the small kitchen table mapping out a list of independent logistics contractors on a legal pad when the engine revved a second time. It was a sharp, aggressive sound designed entirely to demand attention. I walked over to the window and looked down into the narrow, cracked street below. Parked illegally across 2 spaces blocking a neighbor's rusted sedan was a brand-new cherry-red Aston Martin. The gull-wing doors swung upward, and my sister Chloe stepped out onto the broken pavement. She was wearing a pristine white designer sundress and towering heels, looking around the neighborhood with an expression of performative horror. Terrence emerged from the driver's side, adjusting his sunglasses and pressing the lock button on his key fob, which emitted a loud, arrogant chirp that echoed off the brick buildings. My blood ran cold. I turned to DeAndre, who had just stepped out of the tiny bathroom. I told him my sister and her husband were here. DeAndre did not rush. He calmly dried his hands on a towel, his expression unreadable, and moved to stand beside me. Heavy, purposeful footsteps echoed up the wooden stairwell, followed by the loud, obnoxious sound of Chloe complaining about the smell of the building. A sharp, rapid knocking hit our front door. I opened it to find Chloe and Terrence standing in the narrow hallway. Chloe was holding her nose delicately with 2 fingers. Terrence was holding 3 large, heavy-duty black trash bags. Several of our neighbors had peeked out of their doors, watching the spectacle of these 2 wealthy socialites invading our floor. Chloe dropped her hand from her face and plastered on a smile dripping with venomous pity. She practically pushed past me, stepping into our small living room without an invitation. Terrence followed, dropping the heavy trash bags right in the middle of our worn carpet with a dull thud. "Kiara, darling!" Chloe sang out, her eyes darting around the cramped space, taking in the water stains and the mismatched furniture. "We were just in the area. Well, not in the area, obviously no one we know comes to this side of the city. But we thought of you. We brought you some charity." I stared at the black bags, my posture rigid. I demanded to know what they were doing in my home. Terrence chuckled, leaning against the cheap drywall and crossing his arms. He said they knew things must be tight, since I was completely unemployable now. He nudged one of the bags with the toe of his expensive loafer. "Chloe was doing a closet purge. We figured since you are probably shopping at thrift stores these days, you could use some hand-me-downs. Consider it a donation to the less fortunate." Chloe crouched down and dramatically ripped open the top of the nearest bag. She pulled out a fistful of silk and chiffon, tossing it onto the floor. "I mean, some of it is a little damaged," she said with a malicious pout. "I spilled red wine on that Prada skirt, and the dry cleaner said it was ruined. And that Chanel blouse has a huge tear down the side seam. But beggars cannot be choosers, right? You can probably sew the holes up yourself. You always were so good with your hands." It was a calculated theatrical display of humiliation. They wanted me to yell. They wanted me to cry. They wanted me to look at the stained, discarded remnants of my former life and feel utterly defeated. I did not give them the satisfaction. I looked at the pile of ruined clothes, then looked directly into Chloe's eyes. I told her in a voice completely devoid of emotion that she could take her garbage and leave. Terrence let out a loud, mocking laugh. He walked over and wrapped his arm around Chloe's waist, pulling her close. He told me I was being ungrateful. He said I should be thanking them on my knees, considering Sterling Tech was currently breaking industry records while I was rotting in a tenement. He patted the pocket of his tailored jacket, his chest puffing out with arrogant pride. "You should see the stock price, Kiara," Terrence gloated. "We are launching the Apex VR tomorrow. It is Sterling Tech's brand new flagship virtual reality headset. The press is going wild. Reginald just doubled my annual bonus. That is how I bought the Aston Martin downstairs. I am revolutionizing the consumer tech market, and you are sitting here with absolutely nothing." Chloe squealed in agreement, pulling a glossy, thick, spiral-bound folder from her oversized designer tote bag. "Terrence is a genius," she bragged, waving the folder in the air. "He brought the executive summary packet home to show my friends at brunch. Look at it, Kiara. Look at the future of the family you abandoned." She thrust the folder toward me, intending to rub the high-end marketing gloss in my face. But Chloe was careless, and Terrence was arrogant. The folder was not just a marketing brochure. It was the internal executive briefing packet. The cover flipped open in her hands, revealing the dense technical schematics of the Apex 5R's internal hardware architecture. My eyes locked onto the page. Years of intense, high-stakes supply chain management and electronic component manufacturing analysis overrode my anger. I did not see a glossy picture. I saw a bill of materials. I saw the motherboard layout. I saw the specific thermal regulators, the capacitor arrays, and the microprocessing units. And immediately, I saw a catastrophic, multi-billion-dollar disaster. I stepped closer, ignoring Chloe's smug smile, and stared directly at the schematic. "You changed the motherboard supplier," I stated, my voice sharp and analytical. "You stripped out the dual-layered thermal shielding on the primary processing unit." Terrence scoffed, rolling his eyes. He said he optimized the procurement chain. He proudly declared that he found a Tier 3 supplier in Southeast Asia who could manufacture the motherboards at 40% of the original cost. He called it brilliant executive cost-cutting. I looked at him with genuine, unfiltered disbelief. I told him he was a complete fool. I pointed directly at the schematic in Chloe's hand. I explained that the Apex VR required a continuous high-density power draw to render the virtual environments. I broke down the physics of the hardware, detailing how that specific microprocessing unit generated an immense amount of localized heat. You removed the thermal shielding to save a few dollars, I said, my voice rising with urgent technical authority. Those cheap Tier 3 capacitors you approved cannot handle the voltage spike without that specific shielding. If a user runs that headset for more than 45 minutes, the motherboard will not just overheat. It will experience a critical thermal cascade. The components will literally melt off the board. You are going to have 100,000 defective units bricking themselves in the hands of consumers on launch week. Bye-bye. Chloe frowned, pulling the folder back tightly against her chest. She looked at Terrence, a brief flash of confusion crossing her face. Terrence's face flushed bright red, his arrogance masking his complete lack of technical comprehension. He stepped toward me aggressively, invading my space. You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about, Terrence snarled, pointing a finger at me. The engineers signed off on the cost reduction. The prototype passed the initial power-on tests. You are just trying to sabotage my success because you are a bitter, unemployed dropout. You are pathetic, Kiara. You sit in this filthy apartment making up fairy tales because you cannot stand the fact that I am running the company better than you ever could. Initial power-on tests do not simulate sustained consumer usage. Terrence. I fired back, refusing to back down. You are running the entire flagship product line into a brick wall, and when those motherboards fry, Sterling Tech will face a recall that will wipe out a decade of profits. Shut up! Chloe snapped, her face twisting into an ugly sneer. She shoved the executive folder back into her tote bag. We did not come here to listen to your delusional jealousy. We came to drop off some trash. Enjoy the rags, Kiara. Let us go, Terrence. It smells like failure in here. Terrence gave me one last triumphant glare. He mocked my apartment one more time, grabbed Chloe's hand, and pulled her out into the hallway. The door slammed shut behind them, the thin walls vibrating from the force of it. A moment later, the deafening roar of the Aston Martin engine echoed up from the street, peeling away and fading into the distance. I stood in the center of the living room, staring at the torn, stained designer clothes scattered across the floor. My fists were clenched so tightly my nails dug painfully into my palms. I was furious not because of their petty mockery, but because Terrence's profound incompetence was about to destroy the company I had spent my entire adult life building. I turned around to face DeAndre. He was standing perfectly still near the kitchen counter. He was not looking at the trash on the floor. He was looking at his phone. While Chloe had been busy waving the executive summary packet in my face, and while Terrence had been screaming about his own genius, DeAndre had silently stepped to the side. With flawless, calculated precision, he had used his phone's camera to capture crystal-clear, high-resolution photographs of the open folder. He had photographed the entire motherboard schematic, the supplier details, and the specific component identifiers. DeAndre locked his phone screen and looked up at me. His dark eyes were cold-focused and utterly devoid of mercy. He had heard every single word of my technical breakdown. He understood exactly what the thermal failure meant. He did not say a word to me. He simply unbolted the lock, and stepped out of our apartment into the dim, echoing hallway. I walked to the doorway and watched him. He lifted his phone to his ear, waiting for the secure connection to establish. Jamal, DeAndre said, his voice dropping into a low, commanding register that sent a shiver down my spine. I am sending you a schematic right now. Review the Tier 3 supplier they are using for the motherboards. Buy out their entire remaining inventory of the specific thermal shielding alloys they stripped from this design. Buy every single viable replacement component on the global market. He paused, listening to the response on the other end of the line. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. That is right, DeAndre ordered softly into the receiver. Initiate the hardware buyout. Box them in. 2 weeks later, the grand ballroom of the Omni Hotel in downtown Atlanta was transformed into a blinding spectacle of corporate triumph. Laser lights sliced through the artificial fog, illuminating a massive panoramic screen that spanned the entire length of the stage. A digital rendering of the Apex VR headset, rotated in high-definition, sleek, and impossibly futuristic. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with industry journalists, tech influencers, and elite Wall Street analysts. The energy was electric, buzzing with the kind of manufactured hype that moved markets. Reginald Sterling stood at the center of the stage, bathed in a brilliant white spotlight. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit, projecting the image of a seasoned visionary. He leaned into the clear acrylic podium, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. He spoke of paradigm shifts, of breaking the boundaries of human experience, and of Sterling Tech's unwavering commitment to luxury and performance. Behind him, a digital stock ticker projected onto the lower third of the screen, updated in real time. As Reginald revealed the aggressive retail pricing and the projected shipping dates, the green numbers surged. Sterling Tech stock was skyrocketing, jumping 12% in a matter of minutes. Sitting in the front row of the VIP section, Terrence leaned back in a plush velvet chair, basking in the glow of his own perceived genius. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke jacket and smiled smugly for the flashing cameras. Chloe sat next to him, wearing a diamond necklace and a designer gown that cost more than a luxury sedan, waving at the tech bloggers she recognized. In Terrence's mind, he was untouchable. He had secured the component supply chain at a fraction of the historical cost, single-handedly boosting the quarterly profit margins. He was the golden boy of the hour. Then his smartphone vibrated violently inside his breast pocket. Terrence ignored it, keeping his perfect arrogant smile plastered on his face for the press. 10 seconds later, the phone vibrated again, a long, continuous buzz signaling an emergency override. Annoyed, Terrence slipped the phone out and glanced at the screen. The caller ID flashed bright red. It was the director of global manufacturing calling directly from the overseas assembly hub. Terrence frowned, offering a tight smile to Chloe before slipping out of his velvet chair. He ducked under the velvet rope and hurried down a darkened side corridor, pushing through a set of heavy acoustic doors into a soundproof green room. The muffled roar of the crowd vanished, replaced by the sterile hum of the air conditioning. He answered the call, his tone dripping with irritation. He demanded to know why the director was interrupting the most important product launch of the decade. The voice on the other end of the line was completely breathless, bordering on total panic. The director did not offer congratulations, he delivered a nightmare. The primary Tier 3 supplier in Southeast Asia, the exact supplier Terrence had contracted for the critical motherboards to save money, had just filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Terrence froze, his hand tightening around his phone. He barked into the receiver, stating that was impossible. He argued that Sterling Tech had just wired a massive capital advance to secure the next quarter's inventory. The director's voice cracked. He explained that the supplier's assets had been aggressively liquidated overnight. An unknown phantom holding company had swept in, absorbed the entire operation, and immediately shut the factory doors. Every single Sterling Tech contract was voided. All outgoing shipments were canceled. The raw materials, the thermal regulators, and the specific alloys required for the Apex VAR motherboards were simply gone. A cold, heavy dread dropped into Terrence's stomach. He rushed over to a glass coffee table and pulled out his backup tablet. His fingers shook as he bypassed the security protocols and logged directly into the global logistics dashboard. The screen illuminated with a terrifying display. The entire production line operation status, usually a comforting sea of green indicators, was flashing a blinding, urgent red. He pulled up the live inventory feeds for the specialized electronic component manufacturing division. The numbers updated on the screen, verifying the disaster. They had exactly 30 days of inventory left. 30 days before the assembly lines ran entirely dry of the specialized capacitors and thermal shielding required to build the headsets. 30 days before the robotic soldering arms swung to a permanent halt and the conveyor belt stopped moving. The reality of the situation hit Terrence with the force of a freight train. Reginald had just stood on stage and promised millions of retail units to global distributors in time for the holiday rush. The pre-orders were locked in. The contracts were signed. If the production line operation came to a screeching halt, they would miss the delivery window. Missing that window would trigger a cascade of retailer breach of contract penalties. Sterling Tech would not just face a minor delay. They would face a catastrophic multi-billion-dollar default that would bankrupt the company and completely destroy the stock price. The heavy acoustic doors swung open behind him. Reginald Sterling strode into the green room, practically vibrating with triumphant energy. He was holding a crystal glass of expensive scotch, expecting to find Terence celebrating their massive victory. Instead, Reginald stopped dead in his tracks. He took one look at Terence's pale, sweating face and the flashing red warning lights on the tablet screen. The triumphant smile vanished from Reginald's face, replaced instantly by the ruthless, predatory glare of a corporate shark. Reginald set his glass down on a side table. His voice dropped to a terrifyingly quiet whisper. He demanded to know exactly what he was looking at. Terence stammered frantically, trying to swipe away the red alerts on his tablet. He tried to construct a lie, attempting to blame foreign market volatility, sudden tariff changes, and unpredictable global shortages. He carefully omitted the fact that Kiara had stood in his office and explicitly warned him about this exact vulnerability in his cheap supply chain. Reginald did not buy a single word of the spin. He stepped directly into Terence's personal space, snatching the tablet out of his shaking hands. Reginald's eyes scanned the inventory numbers, doing the brutal math in his head. The color drained from the billionaire's face as he realized the magnitude of the impending collapse. Reginald grabbed Terence by the lapels of his custom suit, slamming him back against the wall of the green room. The glass of the framed artwork rattled against the drywall. "You assured me the electronic component manufacturing was completely secure!" Reginald snarled, his voice a low, venomous growl. "You looked me in the eye and guaranteed that your cost reduction strategy was foolproof. I just stood on a global stage and staked my entire legacy on this launch, and you are telling me we are 30 days away from a multi-billion-dollar default." Terence choked on his words, raising his hands in a desperate plea. He swore he could fix it. He promised he would leverage their secondary suppliers, that he would fly overseas tonight and force a new contract through. Reginald shoved him away in absolute disgust. He straightened his own tie, his eyes devoid of any familial warmth. He looked at the man he had chosen over his own granddaughter and delivered a lethal, unyielding ultimatum. "You have exactly 48 hours to secure a new manufacturing contract," Reginald ordered, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "If those assembly lines stop moving, I will not just fire you. I will personally strip you of your vice president title. I will completely dissolve every single stock option you hold. And I will force Chloe to annul this marriage before the press even catches wind of the default. You will leave this family with absolutely nothing but the cheap suit on your back." Reginald turned and walked out of the green room, leaving Terence gasping for air in the silent, sterile space. Panic completely overtook Terence's mind. He pulled out his phone and began dialing frantically. He called every single secondary supplier on his roster. He called factories in Taiwan, assembly hubs in Mexico, and independent contractors in Europe. Every single call ended in a dead end. The suppliers all repeated the exact same terrifying story. The specific thermal shielding alloys and the high-density capacitors required for the Apex VR motherboard were completely wiped off the global market. A massive coordinated buyout had swept through the industry over the past week. No one had the raw materials. No one had the inventory. The supply chain was completely choked out. Terence collapsed onto the leather sofa, burying his face in his hands. He was out of options. He was out of time. Then his lead procurement analyst burst into the green room holding a heavily redacted physical dossier. The analyst looked just as terrified as Terence, but he presented a single sliver of hope. The analyst quickly explained that he had run a desperate sweep of domestic manufacturing capabilities. There was exactly one company left in the entire United States that possessed the advanced robotic production lines, the pristine clean room infrastructure, and the stockpiled volume of raw materials required to meet Sterling Tech's massive order within the 30-day deadline. Terence snatched the dossier out of the analyst's hands, his eyes scanning the cover page. It was a notoriously secretive, highly efficient, and utterly ruthless firm. They were the only ones holding the keys to Sterling Tech's survival. The logo on the top of the page was a sleek, unbranded shield. The company was Aegis Micro. The private jet touched down on a rain-slicked runway in an industrial sector miles away from the glamorous tech hubs of Silicon Valley. Terrence adjusted his silk tie, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. He had spent the entire flight pacing the cabin downing espresso and rehearsing his aggressive negotiation tactics. He was a Sterling, he was the vice president of procurement. He was fully prepared to walk into the Aegis Micro headquarters, throw his corporate weight around, and secure the vital electronic components before Reginald made good on his threat to strip him of everything. A sleek black car transported him through a maze of massive gray concrete facilities. There were no sprawling corporate campuses here, no glass facades, and no manicured Zen gardens. This was a fortress dedicated purely to high-efficiency electronic component manufacturing. Terrence stepped out of the car, his designer Italian leather shoes splashing into a shallow puddle. He cursed under his breath, disgusted by the raw, unpolished environment. He marched through the heavy steel double doors of the main building, flashing his high-clearance Sterling Tech badge at the solitary receptionist. He demanded to be taken to the chief executive officer immediately. Instead of being escorted to a penthouse boardroom with panoramic views and sparkling water, a silent security guard led Terrence down a stark, brightly lit corridor. The hallway smelled of ozone and industrial cleaner. They arrived at a steel observation deck suspended directly above the active manufacturing floor. Terrence looked down through the reinforced glass, expecting a chaotic, grimy warehouse. What he saw was a breathtaking display of flawless production line operation. The facility hummed with an eerie, mechanized perfection. Technicians in full anti-static clean suits monitored automated pick-and-place machines. Robotic soldering arms moved with blinding speed, assembling high-density motherboards with zero margin for error. Massive digital ledgers mounted on the walls displayed real-time equipment maintenance schedules and component inventory levels. It was a masterpiece of industrial logistics, operating with a ruthless efficiency that Sterling Tech's own factories lacked. The heavy metal door of the observation deck swung open. Terrence turned pasting on his most intimidating corporate scowl, expecting to greet a seasoned tech billionaire in a bespoke suit. Instead, the man who walked into the room wore scuffed steel-toed work boots, heavy denim cargo pants, and a faded canvas jacket over a plain black t-shirt. He carried a battered metal clipboard. His hands were large and calloused, marked by years of physical labor. He looked exactly like a man who spent his days unloading freight pallets and managing forklift schedules. "I am Jamal," the man said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that commanded the small room. He did not offer his hand. He simply walked over to the stainless steel conference table and dropped the clipboard onto the surface with a loud metallic clatter. "I am the operations manager for Aegis Micro. I handle the inventory. You have 30 seconds to state your business before I head back down to the floor." Terrence stared at him, absolutely appalled. His face flushed with a toxic cocktail of aristocratic outrage and unfiltered prejudice. He looked Jamal up and down his upper lip, curling into a sneer of profound disgust. "There must be some kind of clerical error," Terrence stated, his voice dripping with condescension. "I am Terrence Sterling. I am the vice president of the largest consumer tech conglomerate in the hemisphere. I am here to negotiate a multi-billion-dollar emergency supply contract. I do not negotiate with warehouse foremen. I do not do business with dock workers. Go back downstairs and fetch whoever actually runs this company." Jamal did not blink. He did not flinch. He simply pulled out a pen, clicked it, and began reviewing a printed manifest attached to his clipboard. "I run the inventory," Jamal repeated coolly, not even looking up from his paperwork. "And right now, I hold the only remaining stockpile of the specific thermal shielding alloys and high-voltage capacitors required to save your flagship virtual reality headset from a catastrophic thermal meltdown. You have 20 seconds left." Terrence's smug demeanor faltered. A cold bead of sweat trickled down the back of his neck. He stepped closer to the table, slamming his palm flat against the metal surface to demand attention. Sterling Tech requires immediate exclusive access to your entire reserve of those components, Terrence barked, trying to regain the upper hand. I am authorizing a direct buyout. We will pay the standard market rate plus a 5% premium for expedited overnight shipping. Draft the contract. I want the first freight trucks loaded and moving to our assembly hubs before midnight. Jamal finally looked up. His dark eyes were sharp, analytical, and entirely unimpressed by the frantic display of wealth and entitlement standing before him. He flipped to the second page on his clipboard, detached a single sheet of paper, and slid it across the table toward Terrence. That is the invoice, Jamal stated softly. Terrence snatched the paper, his eyes scanning the bottom line. He froze. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. He read the number again, convinced his eyes were deceiving him. This is a joke, Terrence gasped, his voice trembling with rising hysteria. This is a typographical error. You multiplied the market rate by 3. You are charging me triple the standard component price. There is no error, Jamal replied, his tone remaining absolutely flat. That is the Aegis Micro baseline price for this specific transaction. That is extortion, Terrence screamed, losing all semblance of corporate composure. He waved the paper frantically in the air. It is blatant illegal price gouging. I will bury you in antitrust lawsuits. I will have an army of Sterling Tech lawyers dismantle this warehouse brick by brick. You cannot arbitrarily triple the cost of essential manufacturing hardware. We can, and we just did, Jamal countered, leaning his hands on the table and matching Terrence's gaze with absolute unyielding authority. We acquired these raw materials legally on the open market. We own the inventory free and clear. And we are applying a standard non-negotiable markup due to extreme unmitigated difficult client risk. Terrence sputtered, completely out of his depth. Difficult client risk. Sterling Tech is a billion-dollar empire. We are the most reliable buyers on the planet. Sterling Tech is a sinking ship piloted by a fool, Jamal corrected smoothly, delivering the assessment without a trace of malice, only cold operational fact. You stripped essential thermal regulators from your flagship product to save a few pennies. You bypassed standard equipment maintenance protocols to rush a launch. Your entire global production line operation is exactly 30 days away from total failure. You are desperate, erratic, and deeply incompetent. That makes you a massive liability to our supply chain. The triple markup offsets the risk of your company defaulting on the final payment when your headset inevitably fails. Jamal tapped his pen against the metal table. You have exactly 24 hours to sign that contract and wire the funds. If the money is not in our holding account by this time tomorrow, I am selling the entire inventory to your biggest overseas competitor. They have already placed a bid. Now, if you will excuse me, I have actual work to do. Jamal turned his back on the furious executive, opened the heavy metal door, and walked out, leaving Terrence standing alone in the observation deck, clutching a piece of paper that represented his absolute ruin. 4 hours later, the atmosphere inside the executive penthouse of the Sterling Tower in Atlanta was suffocatingly tense. Reginald Sterling stood behind his massive mahogany desk, his hands clasped behind his back, looking out over the city skyline. The storm clouds gathering over the skyscrapers perfectly mirrored the dark, explosive mood inside the office. Terrence stood in the center of the Persian rug, his bespoke suit wrinkled from the frantic flight back. He was sweating profusely, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had failed. He had been utterly humiliated by a warehouse manager, and he knew Reginald would annihilate him if he admitted the truth. He had to lie. He had to spin the disaster into a narrative of corporate strength. Reginald turned around slowly, his eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. He demanded the signed Aegis Micro contract. Terrence swallowed hard, pasting on a mask of righteous indignation. He straightened his spine and looked Reginald in the eye. I walked away, Terrence declared, forcing a tone of aggressive confidence. I refused to sign. Reginald's face turned a violent shade of crimson. He took a slow, menacing step forward. He demanded a thorough explanation before he summoned building security to throw Terrence through the plate glass window. "They are thugs, Reginald," Terrence lied smoothly, leaning into the fabrication. "Aegis Micro is not a legitimate manufacturing partner. They are running a predatory extortion ring. The moment I walked in the door, they demanded triple the market value for the components. Unprovoked, blatant extortion. They thought because we were on a tight deadline, they could hold us hostage and bleed our capital dry. I refused to let Sterling Tech be bullied by common criminals. I walked away to protect the company's financial integrity." Terrence puffed out his chest, hoping his performance looked heroic rather than desperate. "We do not negotiate with terrorists. I will find another supplier. I just need a little more time to sweep the European markets." Reginald stared at him, a muscle twitching violently in his jaw. He saw right through the bravado. He saw the panic hiding behind Terrence's eyes. But Reginald was also cornered. Aegis Micro was the only domestic supplier capable of hitting the volume requirement. If Terrence was telling the truth about the price hike, absorbing a triple markup would annihilate their quarterly earnings report and send the board of directors into a frenzy. "You have no other suppliers," Reginald snarled, his voice a lethal quiet rasp. "You burned our existing relationships to save pennies, and now we are staring down the barrel of a multi-billion-dollar default. You created this chokehold, Terrence. You have exactly 29 days left before the assembly lines stop. Find the components, or I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your miserable life paying off the breach of contract penalties." Terrence nodded frantically, backing out of the office and fleeing down the corridor, his mind racing for a non-existent solution. Miles away from the gleaming glass towers of the financial district, the cramped, humid air of the industrial tenement apartment was thick with silence. The radiator hissed in the corner, a persistent rattling sound that usually kept me awake. I had fallen asleep on the lumpy sofa after spending hours mapping out alternative logistics networks. I woke up with a stiff neck, the blue glow of a computer screen casting long, strange shadows across the chipped paint of the living room wall. I rubbed my eyes and sat up quietly. The apartment was entirely still, save for the rhythmic clicking of a keyboard. I walked silently toward the small Formica kitchen table. DeAndre was sitting there, his broad shoulders hunched over his sleek, high-powered laptop. He was completely absorbed in his work, a steaming mug of black coffee resting beside his elbow. He had not heard me get up. I stepped up behind him, intending to ask him if he had finally found a decent job posting in the warehouse district. But as my eyes adjusted to the bright glow of the screen, the words died in my throat. He was not looking at job boards. He was not looking at standard warehouse shift schedules. The screen was filled with highly classified top-tier corporate blueprints. I recognized the formatting instantly. I recognized the specific numerical coding systems. I was staring directly at the proprietary, heavily encrypted internal schematics for Sterling Tech's entire global production line operation. The display showed a live, real-time map of every single automated soldering station, every conveyor belt speed, and every specific equipment maintenance log across all 3 of Reginald's overseas factories. The screen tracked the precise minute-by-minute inventory depletion of the Apex VR thermal regulators. I stopped breathing. The sheer level of security clearance required to access this specific dashboard was astronomical. Reginald guarded these particular operational feeds with military-grade encryption. Not even the senior board members had real-time access to this level of granular manufacturing data. I looked at the complex data streams reflecting in DeAndre's dark-focused eyes. The man sitting at my broken kitchen table, the man who wore scuffed work boots and carried a lunch pail, was currently monitoring the exact operational heartbeat of my grandfather's dying empire. I stepped into the harsh glow of the monitor. I demanded to know how he had bypassed military-grade encryption to access the Sterling Tech Global Logistics dashboard. I asked him who he really was. DeAndre did not flinch. He calmly pressed a single key, locking the screen and plunging the kitchen back into the dim shadows of the alleyway streetlight. He stood up, towering over me, his presence filling the cramped space. He reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear. He told me that the supply chain industry was a very small world. He said that when you work the docks and manage freight long enough, you meet people who know how to unlock doors. He promised me that he was exactly the man I married, just with a few extra tools in his belt. He kissed my forehead, his lips warm against my skin. He told me to get some sleep, promising that the morning news would be incredibly entertaining. He was right. The fallout did not take 30 days. The corporate world is fueled by whispers and panic, and the sudden violent buyout of the Southeast Asian motherboard supplier sent shockwaves directly to Wall Street. By Tuesday morning, the Sterling Tech production line operation came to a violent screeching halt. The specialized robotic soldering arms in the primary overseas assembly hub froze in place. The digital ledgers tracking electronic component manufacturing blinked red across the globe. Without the specific thermal regulators and high-density capacitors required for the Apex VR, the automated assembly lines automatically triggered a hard shutdown. The complex variables of the motherboard required pinpoint precision. The power draw was too massive, the thermal load too intense for substitute parts. Terrence had completely mismanaged the microtolerances. He had ordered the factories to attempt a trial run with standard silicon capacitors to bridge the gap. The resulting test units literally caught fire on the testing racks, melting the plastic casings and triggering a hazardous materials evacuation. The internal disaster leaked to the press within hours. I sat on our thrifted sofa, watching the small television screen as major financial news networks broke the story. Banners flashed in bright red across the bottom of the broadcast. Sterling Tech faces catastrophic supply chain failure. Apex VR launch delayed indefinitely. The market reaction was swift and merciless. Investors panicked, dumping their shares at a record pace. The stock price, which had soared during Reginald's arrogant press conference, went into a terrifying freefall. It plummeted by 10% in the first hour, then 20%, finally bottoming out at a staggering 40% drop before the trading day even ended. Billions of dollars in market capitalization evaporated into thin air. Inside the glass-walled boardroom of Sterling Tower, the atmosphere was a toxic mixture of rage and terror. Reginald Sterling stood at the head of the massive obsidian table, his face a mask of furious disbelief. The board of directors, men and women who had blindly trusted his judgment for decades, were in open mutiny. A senior board member slammed his fist against the table, demanding immediate answers. He pointed a trembling finger at Terrence, who was sitting near the back, sweating through his custom shirt and looking physically ill. The board member screamed that Terrence had jeopardized the entire conglomerate to save a fractional percentage on procurement. He demanded Terrence be terminated immediately and investigated for criminal negligence. Terrence stammered, desperately looking to Reginald for protection. He babbled excuses about unpredictable market fluctuations and hostile corporate sabotage. He claimed Aegis Micro was running an illegal cartel, extorting them unprovoked. Reginald silenced him with a single lethal glare. The patriarch of the Sterling Empire was backed into a corner. The board was threatening a vote of no confidence. If the assembly lines did not resume operation by the end of the week, the major retail distributors would invoke their penalty clauses, triggering a default that would wipe out the family legacy permanently. Reginald demanded a solution, his voice shaking with a terrifying, contained fury. He ordered his senior analyst to find a workaround, a secondary supplier, a black market broker, anything to acquire the thermal shielding alloys. The analyst responded with grim silence. Aegis Micro held an absolute monopoly. Back in the dim light of our tenement apartment, I sat at the kitchen table, my eyes glued to the financial ticker scrolling across the television screen. The anchor was breaking down the exact hardware failure, citing anonymous insider reports about the melted prototypes and the missing thermal shielding. Years of intense corporate conditioning kicked in. My mind bypassed the anger and the satisfaction of seeing Terrence fail. Instinct took over. I pulled my legal pad and a pen toward me. My hand moved rapidly across the paper, mapping out a desperate recovery strategy. I was calculating alternative thermal load distributions. I was charting emergency freight routes from secondary tech sectors in Eastern Europe, trying to find a combination of lesser components that could be undervolted to prevent the motherboards from frying. I was breathing quickly, completely lost in the mathematical puzzle of saving Sterling Tech. I had spent my entire life protecting that company. The urge to fix the broken system was practically hardwired into my DNA. A shadow fell over my notepad. DeAndre stepped up to the table. He stood beside my chair, his large frame blocking the flickering light from the television. He looked down at the frantic, brilliant equations I was scribbling across the yellow paper. He watched me working to save the very people who had thrown me into this poverty trap. He reached down, his strong, calloused fingers wrapping gently around my hand. He stopped the movement of the pen. The warmth of his touch broke my intense concentration. I looked up at him, my chest heaving, the pen hovering above the paper. DeAndre did not look angry. He looked at me with deep, unwavering conviction. He gently took the pen from my hand and set it down on the table, far out of my reach. "Let them drown," he said softly. The words hung in the quiet air of the apartment. Let them drown. I looked at the pen, then at the television screen, showing Reginald's empire burning to the ground. DeAndre was right. They had stolen my life's work. They had humiliated me. They had chosen a fraud over their own blood. I leaned back in my chair, the tension slowly draining from my shoulders. I let out a long, shaky breath and nodded. I would not save them. While I let go of the Sterling legacy, Reginald was clinging to it with feral desperation. He was sitting alone in his penthouse office when his private intelligence firm delivered a critical piece of information. The elusive, unnamed chief executive officer of Aegis Micro was emerging from the shadows. The CEO was hosting an ultra-exclusive, invite-only industry gala that upcoming Saturday night at a private estate on the outskirts of the city. It was slated to be a gathering of the most powerful tech titans, venture capitalists, and manufacturing barons in the world. It was a closed-door event designed entirely for high-level power brokering. Reginald saw his only remaining lifeline. If his procurement department could not negotiate with the warehouse staff, he would go straight to the top. He would bypass the corporate red tape and handle the CEO face-to-face. He immediately summoned Terrence and Chloe to his office. When they arrived looking terrified of further reprimand, Reginald issued his final, uncompromising directive. He ordered them to hire the best stylists in the city. He commanded them to wear their most expensive jewelry and their finest tailored suits. They were going to crash the Aegis Micro Gala. They were going to use the Sterling name to bypass security, corner the CEO, and secure the manufacturing components before the board of directors could strip Reginald of his power. He looked Terrence dead in the eye and stated the brutal reality of their mission. They were going to walk into that ballroom, find the man who held their future in his hands, and beg for mercy on their hands and knees if necessary. The threat hung in the air of the penthouse, heavy and suffocating. Terrence fled Reginald's office with his heart hammering against his ribs, his mind spinning into a dark, frantic abyss. He knew exactly what crashing the gala meant. Reginald was a ruthless pragmatist. If they managed to secure a face-to-face meeting with the elusive Aegis Micro CEO, Reginald would not just beg. He would offer a blood sacrifice. Reginald would point the finger squarely at Terrence, firing him publicly and brutally to appease the CEO and secure the manufacturing components. Terrence would be ruined, blacklisted from the industry, and left completely destitute. He could not let Saturday night happen on Reginald's terms. He had to make a desperate play. He had to secure the supply chain himself, bypass his grandfather entirely, and force his way back into the position of power. Terrence did not return to his luxury condo. Instead, he rented an unmarked sedan and drove straight back to the industrial district, parking in the shadows near the Aegis Micro manufacturing fortress. He waited for hours, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the heavy steel exit doors. Finally, as the shift changed, he spotted him. Jamal walked out of the facility, his heavy steel-toed boots scraping against the pavement. He looked tired but resolute, heading down the block toward a dimly lit, greasy spoon diner that catered to the dock workers and night shift mechanics. Terrence waited until Jamal was seated in a worn vinyl booth before making his move. He pushed through the glass doors of the diner, ignoring the smell of stale fry grease and cheap coffee. He marched directly to Jamal's table and slid uninvited into the booth opposite him. Jamal did not look surprised. He simply took a slow bite of his burger, his dark eyes locking onto Terrence with absolute, terrifying calm. He placed his smartphone face down on the table, casually tapping the screen once. "I told you the price, Sterling," Jamal said, his deep voice barely carrying over the hum of the diner's old refrigerator. "And I told you the deadline. You are wasting your time." "Everyone has a price," Terrence hissed, leaning forward, his eyes darting around the empty diner to ensure no one was listening. He reached into his tailored breast pocket and pulled out a sleek titanium flash drive, sliding it across the sticky table. "This drive contains our most classified logistics forecasts. It holds Duyen 1_19.docx, Duyen 2_19.docx, Duyen 3_19.docx, and Duyen 4_19. DOCX. These files prove my absolute authority over the Sterling Tech supply chain. I can authorize off-book payments that Reginald will never even see." Jamal glanced at the flash drive, then back at Terrence, his expression completely blank. "I do not want your files," Jamal stated softly. "I want the CEO's direct line," Terrence demanded, his voice shaking with unhinged desperation. "Or better yet, you are the operations manager. You hold the keys to the warehouse. You can authorize a quiet release of the thermal regulators right now. Do it, and I will wire $5 million into any offshore account you choose by midnight, untraceable, tax-free. You will never have to work in a miserable, grimy warehouse for the rest of your life. You can be a king." Terrence smiled a slick, oily grin, entirely convinced that his immense wealth could shatter the integrity of a common laborer. He leaned back, waiting for the inevitable greed to wash over Jamal's face. Jamal picked up his napkin, slowly wiped his mouth, and tossed it onto his plate. He picked up his smartphone, holding it so the screen briefly reflected the harsh diner lights. A small red icon blinked steadily in the corner of the screen. He had recorded every single second of the interaction, every word of the illegal kickback offer, every desperate, pathetic plea. "You are a very small man in a very deep ocean," Jamal said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You think you can buy integrity with the loose change in your pocket. You think because I wear boots and carry a clipboard I am desperate for your dirty money. You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with." Jamal stood up, towering over the booth. He looked down at Terrence with profound, unadulterated pity. "Keep your flash drive, Terrence, and keep your $5 million. You are going to need it to pay for your defense attorneys. Do not ever approach me again." Jamal walked out of the diner, the bell above the door chiming lightly in his wake. Terrence sat frozen in the vinyl booth, the ambient noise of the diner rushing back into his ears. A cold, paralyzing terror gripped his lungs. Jamal had recorded the bribe. Terrence had just handed Aegis Micro the exact ammunition they needed to completely obliterate him. He was a dead man walking. Meanwhile, miles away in the cramped, humid tenement apartment, Kiara was systematically closing out the windows on her laptop. She was burying the ghost of Sterling Tech forever. She permanently deleted the recovery strategies she had obsessively drafted. Wiping Duyen 1_20.docs, Duyen 2_20.docs, Duyen 3_20.docs, and Duyen 4_20.docx from her hard drive. DeAndre was right. It was time to let the Empire drown. She closed the laptop with a definitive snap, the sound echoing loudly in the quiet living room. The heavy front door clicked open. DeAndre walked in, bringing the crisp, cool night air with him. He looked exhausted from his shift, dust clinging to his canvas jacket, but his eyes were completely alight. There was a dangerous, thrilling energy radiating from his massive frame. He walked directly to the kitchen table where Kiara sat. He did not say a word. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pulled out a thick, matte black envelope, and placed it gently on the formica surface between them. Kiara frowned, looking from the envelope to her husband's face. She reached out her fingers, breaking the heavy wax seal. She slid the contents onto the table. It was a shimmering, heavy gold ticket. The cardstock was incredibly thick, embossed with sharp, minimalist black lettering. It was an all-access VIP pass to the Aegis Micro Gala at the Waldorf Astoria. Kiara stopped breathing. She stared at the golden ticket as if it were a live grenade. The Waldorf Astoria was the absolute epicenter of high society. This was not a local networking event. This was the pinnacle of global elite gatherings, a fortress guarded by ruthless public relations teams and armed security. DeAndre, Kiara breathed, her voice trembling. How did you get this? This is impossible. You work the loading docks. DeAndre pulled out a chair and sat down facing her. He took her hands in his large, calloused thumbs, rubbing soothing circles over her knuckles. My boss gave it to me, DeAndre said smoothly, his deep voice vibrating with a quiet, powerful confidence. The CEO is planning a massive new expansion phase for Aegis Micro. He wants to move into consumer hardware. He knows I am married to a brilliant visionary engineer. He specifically requested your presence. He needs a true industry expert to evaluate a new venture, someone who sees the flaws that everyone else misses. He wants your unbiased eye. He wants you there. Kiara pulled her hands away, her chest tightening with sudden, overwhelming panic. She pushed her chair back and stood up, pacing the small confines of the kitchen. I cannot go to the Waldorf Astoria, Kiara stammered, her heart racing. DeAndre, you do not understand. Reginald will be there. Terrence and Chloe will be there. The entire technology press corps will be swarming the ballroom. They banished me. They publicly ruined me. If I walk into that room, they will laugh me right back out the door. I am a disgraced exile living in a tenement. I cannot face that world again. DeAndre stood up. He closed the distance between them, wrapping his strong arms around her waist and pulling her gently against his chest. He looked down into her panicked eyes, his gaze steady, grounding, and full of fierce, uncompromising love. They took your company, Kiara. DeAndre whispered, his voice a solid anchor in the storm of her anxiety. They took your corner office, they took your bank accounts, but they never took your mind. You are the smartest person in any room you walk into. You are a queen, and they are nothing but thieves wearing borrowed crowns. I need you there. My career depends on this evaluation. If you walk into that ballroom with your head held high, you will prove to every single person in that room that they did not break you. Kiara looked up at him. She saw the exhaustion in his face, the years of hard labor he had endured to keep food on their table. He was asking her to stand by his side to help him climb the corporate ladder at Aegis Micro. He believed in her brilliance when her own blood had discarded her as garbage. If this gala could secure her husband's future, she could not let her fear dictate her choices. She could not hide in the shadows any longer. She took a deep breath, the panic slowly hardening into a sharp, crystalline resolve. She reached up and touched his cheek. Okay, Kiara said, her voice dropping to a fierce, steady whisper. I will go. The following 48 hours were a blur of meticulous, quiet preparation. Kiara had absolutely no money to buy a designer gown. She could not walk into the Waldorf Astoria wearing off-the-rack department store clearance. But she possessed a brilliant structural mind. Engineering was not just about silicon and motherboards. It was about architecture, stress points, and flawless execution. She took $20 from their grocery jar and walked to a vintage thrift store on the edge of the district. She spent hours hunting through the racks until she found a damaged, oversized emerald green silk gown from a bygone era. The hem was torn, the bodice was shapeless, and the zipper was broken. It was a complete disaster. Kiara brought it back to the apartment and set up her grandmother's ancient sewing machine on the kitchen table. For 2 days, she barely slept. She ripped out the original seams, utilizing her architectural precision to completely restructure the garment. She dropped the back, creating a daring, elegant, plunging line. She tailored the bodice so it fit her frame like a second skin, utilizing invisible structural boning to create a flawless, statuesque silhouette. She repaired the hem, allowing the heavy emerald silk to pool and glide around her feet like liquid glass. When Saturday evening finally arrived, the transformation was absolute. Kiara stepped out of the tiny, cramped bathroom. The emerald silk hugged her curves perfectly, the rich color igniting the golden undertones of her skin and bringing a dangerous, brilliant fire to her eyes. She wore no expensive diamonds, no ostentatious necklaces. She wore only the sheer, unadulterated power of her own resilience. DeAndre was waiting in the living room. He had rented a classic, sharply tailored black tuxedo. He looked impossibly handsome, carrying the broad-shouldered elegance of a king disguising himself among mortals. When he turned and saw her, he literally stopped breathing. His eyes widened, completely mesmerized by the fierce, breathtaking woman standing before him. He walked over, offering his arm with a slow, respectful bow. "You look like royalty," DeAndre murmured, his voice thick with awe and absolute adoration. Kiara smiled, a sharp, dangerous curve of her lips. She linked her arm through his, feeling the solid, immovable strength of him beneath the tailored jacket. They walked out of the rundown tenement building, leaving the broken radiators and the peeling paint behind. They stepped into the cool evening air, completely unafraid. They were not walking into the Waldorf Astoria as defeated, broken exiles. They were walking directly into the lion's den, and they were ready to roar. The Waldorf Astoria loomed ahead like a glittering, impenetrable fortress of extreme wealth. The grand entrance was a chaotic, blinding spectacle of flashing camera bulbs, velvet ropes, and elite power brokering. An army of valets in crisp, tailored uniforms swarmed the circular driveway, opening the doors of armored Maybachs and sleek Rolls-Royces. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, the sharp bite of the evening chill, and the electric, predatory buzz of the tech industry's most vicious players. This was the Aegis Micro Gala, a closed-door sanctuary where billions of dollars would change hands before midnight. A fleet of 3 elongated black limousines glided to a halt at the curb, their tinted windows reflecting the aggressive strobe lights of the paparazzi. The heavy rear door of the lead vehicle swung open, and Reginald Sterling stepped onto the pavement. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that cost more than a luxury sports car, his posture rigid with the absolute authority he believed he commanded. Beatrice Sterling followed, wrapped in a heavy mink coat and dripping in rare diamonds, her face pulled into a tight aristocratic mask of superiority. Chloe and Terrence emerged from the second limousine. Chloe frantically adjusted her designer gown, practicing her manufactured red carpet smile for the cameras, while Terrence furiously checked his phone, the impending doom of the Aegis micro contract and the recorded bribes still suffocating him. Reginald expected the velvet ropes to part instantly. He marched directly toward the primary VIP entrance, flanked by his family, fully prepared to bypass the hundreds of mid-level executives and desperate tech founders waiting in the freezing night air. He approached the imposing security desk, expecting the guards to recognize his face, apologize for the crowds, and usher him directly into the grand ballroom. Instead, a massive security operative held up a white-gloved hand, physically blocking the patriarch of the Sterling Empire. The guard scanned Reginald's digital invitation with a handheld device. A sharp negative tone beeped from the scanner. The guard pointed a thick finger toward the end of the plaza, instructing Reginald that his pass was designated strictly for the standard corporate tier. He told the billionaire to join the general admission line, wrapping entirely around the side of the building. Reginald's face flushed a dangerous mottled purple. He demanded to speak to the event coordinator immediately. He barked that he was Reginald Sterling, that his family did not stand in lines like common cattle, and that he required immediate unrestricted access to the VIP reception to speak with the Aegis Micro Chief Executive Officer. The guard remained completely immovable, staring down at Reginald with absolute apathy. He stated clearly that there were no exceptions for anyone. The VIP lane was strictly reserved for gold-tier ticket holders. He instructed Reginald to step aside immediately or forfeit his entry entirely. Humiliated, emasculated, and seething with a quiet, lethal rage, Reginald was forced to pivot. He marched his family away from the flashing cameras and the exclusive red carpet, trudging toward the back of the massive, slow-moving standard corporate line. Beatrice complained bitterly, clutching her mink coat tightly around her shoulders as the biting wind threatened to ruin her perfectly styled hair. Chloe whined loudly that her custom Italian heels were not meant for standing on cold concrete. Terrence simply sweated, his anxiety amplifying with every passing second. His eyes darted nervously around the plaza. He needed to find the CEO. He needed to invalidate the evidence Jamal held. His entire survival depended on getting inside that ballroom and rewriting the narrative. As the Sterlings stood shivering and furious in the general admission queue, a standard unmarked black town car pulled up to the curb. The rear door opened, and DeAndre stepped out into the flashing lights. He adjusted the cuffs of his rented black tuxedo, his broad shoulders and commanding physical presence, making him look like a heavyweight champion entering the ring. He reached back into the car, offering his large hand. Kiara emerged into the blinding glow of the Waldorf Astoria. The emerald green silk of her tailored gown caught the ambient light, shimmering like a liquid jewel against the dark night. The plunging back and the flawless architectural structural design highlighted her every curve, projecting a fierce, untouchable elegance that instantly turned heads. She walked with her chin held high, her spine perfectly straight, channeling every ounce of her anger, her resilience, and her unmatched brilliance into her posture. She did not look like a woman who had been banished to a crumbling tenement apartment. She looked like a woman who owned the entire city. DeAndre offered his arm. Kiara looped her hand through it, and together they bypassed the massive general admission line entirely. They walked with deliberate, unhurried grace, heading directly toward the exclusive VIP entrance that Reginald had just been denied. From her miserable spot shivering behind a velvet rope 50 yards away, Beatrice Sterling gasped. She nudged her husband violently, her heavily manicured finger pointing directly at the couple gliding up the red carpet. Reginald turned, his eyes narrowing into furious slits. Chloe and Terrence followed his gaze. Absolute shock slammed into the Sterling family with the force of a physical blow. Terrence's jaw practically hit the pavement. He recognized Kiara instantly, but the massive man walking beside her made the blood freeze entirely in his veins. It was the warehouse manager. It was Jamal, the man who had humiliated him in the observation deck, the man who had laughed at his $5 million bribe, the man who held the digital recording that could send Terrence to federal prison, was walking up the VIP red carpet with the disgraced, banished granddaughter of the Sterling Empire. For a fraction of a second, Terrence felt pure, unadulterated terror. But then his panicked mind constructed a rapid, desperate rationalization. Jamal was a dock worker. He drove a forklift. There was absolutely no way a warehouse foreman had secured a legitimate invitation to the most exclusive power brokering event of the decade. Terrence convinced himself that Jamal and Kiara were crashing the gala. They were desperate, impoverished, and trying to sneak into the venue to exact some sort of petty revenge. Shock instantly curdled into vicious, malicious glee. The Sterlings saw a golden opportunity to exert their dominance, humiliate the woman who had dared to cross them, and eliminate a massive threat all at once. Beatrice abandoned her place in the corporate line, marching right up to the velvet rope separating them from the VIP lane. Her voice sliced through the hum of the crowd, loud, shrill, and deliberately carrying to the nearby industry journalists. "Well, look what the stray cat dragged out of the gutters," Beatrice sneered, her eyes raking over Kiara's emerald silk with exaggerated revulsion. "I suppose that is what passes for formal wear in the slums these days. Did you stitch that monstrosity together from cheap curtains, Kiara? It looks incredibly tragic. You always did lack the fundamental refinement required for high society. You are making an absolute fool of yourself." Kiara stopped walking. She turned her head slowly, her dark eyes locking onto Beatrice with terrifying calm. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She simply offered a cold, pitying smile that made Beatrice's face flush with sudden defensive anger. Chloe stepped up beside her mother, laughing cruelly and pointing at the couple. She loudly questioned how an unemployed, disgraced ex-director could even afford the cab ride to the venue, let alone dream of stepping foot inside the Waldorf Astoria. She loudly announced to the surrounding crowd that Kiara had been fired for gross incompetence and had clearly lost her mind. But Terrence was not laughing. He was staring at DeAndre with a mixture of terror and aristocratic fury. This was his chance to eliminate the threat entirely. If he could publicly humiliate the Aegis micro-operations manager, if he could get the man arrested and thrown out into the street, he could invalidate the recording of his bribe by labeling Jamal a deranged stalker. Terrence pushed his way to the front of the velvet rope, flagging down a passing security team with frantic, aggressive gestures. He pointed a trembling finger directly at DeAndre and Kiara, his voice booming with manufactured corporate outrage. "Security!" Terrence yelled, waving his arms wildly to draw the maximum amount of attention from the guards and the flashing cameras. You need to apprehend those two individuals immediately. That man is a dock worker. He is a common, uneducated warehouse boy from the industrial district. And that woman is a disgraced terminated employee with a documented history of corporate sabotage. They have absolutely no business being anywhere near this establishment. They do not have invitations. They are trespassing on private property. They are sneaking in to steal food from the buffet and harass the legitimate paying guests. Remove them right now. The crowd around the entrance fell into a hushed, tense silence. Dozens of cameras pivoted rapidly toward the commotion. The journalists sensed blood in the water, their lenses focusing tightly on the beautiful woman in the emerald gown and the massive man standing calmly beside her. Terrence smirked, crossing his arms over his chest, his heart soaring with temporary victory. He looked at DeAndre with absolute, unfiltered contempt, fully expecting the large man to shrink away in shame and panic. He expected Kiara to burst into tears of humiliation and flee into the dark night. He was entirely ready to watch them be dragged away in handcuffs on a public stage. 6 heavily armed security guards led by the hulking head of event security immediately broke away from their posts and descended upon the red carpet. They moved with aggressive military precision, forming a tight, inescapable perimeter around Kiara and DeAndre. The head of security, a towering man with a scarred face and a stern, uncompromising glare, stepped directly into DeAndre's personal space. He reached out his thick hand, his voice a low, threatening rumble as he demanded to see their credentials immediately. Terrence laughed aloud, turning back to Reginald and loudly boasting that he had just saved the prestigious gala from a pair of low-class thieves. Beatrice folded her arms, lifting her chin and watching the impending arrest with undisguised venomous pleasure. DeAndre did not break a sweat. He did not raise his voice. He did not even glance at the gloating Sterling family. He reached slowly, deliberately into the inner breast pocket of his rented tuxedo jacket. He withdrew the thick, matte black envelope. With a smooth, casual flick of his wrist, he slid the shimmering, heavy gold ticket out and placed it directly into the open palm of the head of security. The security chief looked down at the ticket. He stared at the sharp, minimalist black lettering. He stared at the unique, unforgeable holographic watermark that pulsed vividly under the red carpet lights. He recognized the specific elite coding that designated the highest possible level of clearance in the entire venue. The color instantly drained from the security chief's scarred face. The menacing, authoritative glare vanished entirely, replaced by an expression of absolute, unadulterated terror. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically from the heavy gold ticket to DeAndre's calm, patient, unyielding face. The head of security did not grab DeAndre by the collar. He did not call for backup. He did not ask them to leave the premises. Instead, the massive, imposing security chief took a hurried, frantic step backward. He clicked his heels together, lowered his head, and bowed deeply and respectfully at the waist. "Welcome to the Waldorf Astoria, sir. Please proceed." The security chief's voice carried across the sudden heavy silence of the entrance plaza. He snapped his thick fingers and his elite guards immediately sprang into action. They physically unclipped the heavy braided velvet ropes that guarded the gold-tier entrance, shoving back the throngs of aggressive photographers to clear a wide, pristine path. The chief extended a white-gloved hand, personally stepping forward to escort Kiara and DeAndre down the private red carpet, toward the glowing double doors of the grand ballroom. Terrence watched this happen with his mouth hanging wide open, his entire reality fractured. He gripped the velvet rope, his knuckles turning white, completely unable to process how a warehouse laborer was being treated like foreign royalty. "Wait!" Terrence shrieked, his voice cracking with absolute panic. "That is a mistake. You need to check that ticket again. It is a forgery. That man drives a forklift." The security guards ignored him entirely. They closed the velvet rope firmly behind Kiara and DeAndre, locking it into place with a definitive metallic click. Just as Kiara and DeAndre stepped under the protective heated awning of the main entrance, the bitter night air finally gave way to a sudden freezing downpour. Icy rain began to lash the pavement, soaking the standard corporate line in seconds. Reginald Sterling, the patriarch who demanded absolute obedience from the world, found himself standing in a torrential downpour. His custom tuxedo was instantly ruined. Beatrice shrieked as the freezing rain flattened her perfectly styled hair and soaked her extremely expensive mink coat. She began shoving her way toward the front, demanding an umbrella, demanding entry, and screaming at the stoic bouncers who simply stared straight ahead. Terrence completely lost his mind. The impending doom of the Aegis micro contract crashed over him, mixing with the sheer indignity of the moment. He grabbed the velvet rope and tried to pull it down, yelling that he was a Sterling, that he owned half the city, and that he would have every single guard fired by morning. "Do you know who I am?" Reginald bellowed, spit flying from his lips as the rain plastered his silver hair to his forehead. "I will buy the firm that employs you, and I will personally see to it that you starve in the streets." The paparazzi did not miss a single second. Smelling the absolute destruction of a corporate dynasty, they went into a feeding frenzy. Flashbulbs erupted in blinding waves. The tech industry press corps captured every angle of the mighty Sterling family, throwing a desperate, pathetic tantrum in the freezing rain, while being aggressively corralled by venue security. They documented Reginald's humiliated purple face. They recorded Terrence screaming like a spoiled child. The complete collapse of the Sterling dignity was immortalized in high definition. Kiara did not look back. She walked through the gilded double doors and stepped into a world of unimaginable power. The grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria was a breathtaking spectacle. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over towering floral arrangements and ice sculptures carved into the shape of microchips. Waiters in pristine white jackets circulated with silver trays of caviar and vintage champagne. The air vibrated with the quiet, intense hum of billionaires negotiating global markets. This was the true apex of the technology sector, a room filled with venture capitalists, manufacturing barons, and Silicon Valley titans. A perfectly manicured hostess greeted them immediately, taking DeAndre's coat and offering them crystal flutes of champagne. Kiara took a deep breath, her fingers tightening slightly around DeAndre's arm. She felt a brief, terrifying spike of imposter syndrome. These were the people who had read the industry blogs about her termination. These were the executives Reginald Sterling had actively poisoned against her. But as she caught her reflection in a massive gilded mirror, the panic evaporated. The emerald silk gown draped flawlessly over her frame, radiating a quiet, undeniable strength. She was not the broken woman Terrence had tried to destroy. She was a master of structural engineering, a visionary who understood complex variables better than anyone in this room. DeAndre looked down at her, his eyes warm and completely fearless. He leaned in his lips, brushing her ear. "You own this room," he whispered. "Show them." They began to move through the ballroom. Kiara braced herself for the whispers, the pointed stares, and the inevitable mockery she assumed would follow her presence. Instead, something entirely baffling happened. A silver-haired man wearing a sharp Italian suit approached them. Kiara recognized him instantly. It was the chief financial officer of a massive global hardware conglomerate, a man notorious for his ruthless business tactics. He stopped directly in front of them, but he did not look at Kiara with disdain. He looked directly at DeAndre. The executive offered a firm, highly respectful nod. DeAndre returned the gesture smoothly, lifting his champagne flute in a silent, polite greeting. The executive smiled warmly and stepped aside, making room for them to pass. Kiara blinked, completely thrown off balance. She looked at DeAndre, trying to process what had just occurred. Before she could ask a single question, it happened again. A group of European software developers parted like the Red Sea as they approached. The lead developer, a billionaire innovator, caught DeAndre's eye, placed a hand over his heart, and bowed his head in a gesture of profound respect. They continued walking toward the center of the ballroom, and the pattern repeated itself with dizzying frequency. Global tech moguls, venture capitalists, and manufacturing titans all paused their conversations. They stopped negotiating. They offered deferential nods, raised glasses, and respectful smiles, all directed squarely at the large, broad-shouldered man in the rented tuxedo walking by her side. Kiara felt her mind spinning. The mathematics of the situation simply did not add up. DeAndre worked the loading docks. He managed freight schedules and yelled at truck drivers. He came home smelling of warehouse dust and engine oil. Yet the most powerful elite figures in the global technology sector were treating him with a level of deference usually reserved for royalty. She stopped walking, pulling him gently toward a quiet alcove near a towering champagne tower. She looked up at him, her dark eyes wide with intense confusion. "DeAndre," Kiara said, keeping her voice low so the surrounding billionaires would not hear. "What is happening right now? Why is the vice president of global logistics for a multinational conglomerate bowing to you? You are a warehouse manager. They are treating you like you own the building." Yeah, ma'am. Gone. DeAndre took a slow sip of his champagne. He looked out over the crowded ballroom, his expression perfectly calm, utterly unbothered by the intense scrutiny of the global elite. He looked back down at her, a charming, easy smile spreading across his handsome face. "The supply chain is the lifeblood of this entire industry, Kiara," DeAndre explained smoothly, his deep voice wrapping around her fears and neutralizing them. "Without the warehouses, these billionaires have nothing to sell. My boss is a very generous guy. He takes care of his people and he makes sure the industry knows who keeps the lights on. People respect the company. They are just showing respect to the Aegis micro brand. That is all." It was a perfectly logical explanation delivered with complete sincerity. Kiara wanted to push harder to analyze the strange dynamic playing out across the ballroom floor, but another group of executives approached. This time the attention shifted to her. A prominent tech journalist, the very same one who had written a scathing article about Sterling Tech's recent production failures, stepped forward. He did not mention her termination. He did not bring up Reginald Sterling's press conference. Instead, he complimented her emerald gown and asked her a highly technical question regarding the rumors of the melting prototypes on the Sterling assembly line. Kiara took a breath, letting her brilliant mind take over. She answered flawlessly. She did not speak with bitterness or petty revenge. She answered with cold, hard science. She broke down the complex variables of thermal load limits in standard silicon capacitors, elegantly outlining exactly why the Sterling VR headset was doomed to fail without the specialized Aegis microalloys. She spoke with such authority and brilliance that a crowd naturally formed around her. Investors who had dumped Sterling stock that very morning listened to her, realizing instantly that the true genius of the Sterling empire had just been fired. For the next hour, Kiara was exactly where she belonged. She engaged in high-level debates about hardware architecture. She discussed the future of virtual reality interfaces. She proved without a shadow of a doubt that her intellect was untouched by the family betrayal. She was shining, and DeAndre stood right beside her, watching her reclaim her power with an expression of deep, unwavering pride. Just as Kiara finished explaining a revolutionary concept for solid-state batteries to a captivated group of investors, the atmosphere in the grand ballroom shifted. The soft, ambient classical music abruptly faded into silence. The massive crystal chandeliers overhead dimmed, plunging the perimeter of the room into shadows while illuminating the main stage at the far end of the hall. The low hum of 1,000 conversations instantly ceased as anticipation crackled through the air like an electric current. A single brilliant spotlight hit the podium. A polished, sharply dressed announcer stepped up to the microphone, his voice echoing powerfully across the silent, waiting crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer began, his tone ringing with absolute authority. "Welcome to the dawn of a new era in global technology. We have gathered the brightest minds and the most powerful leaders in the world under one roof tonight. The time has come to reveal the future." The crowd held its collective breath. Even the billionaires stood completely still, their eyes locked onto the stage. "Please direct your attention to the podium," the announcer boomed, his voice vibrating through the massive speakers. "It is my profound honor to introduce the architect of our future. Please welcome the founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Micro. He will now address the crowd and announce our company's newest industry-shaking acquisition." The spotlight swung wildly away from the announcer, sweeping in a wide arc across the dark ballroom, searching the floor for the man who controlled the global supply chain, the man who had the power to make or break empires with a single word. The beam of pure white light slashed through the darkness of the grand ballroom. It swept past the venture capitalists. It moved past the Silicon Valley titans. It bypassed the global software tycoons. The brilliant circle of light glided across the polished marble floor and stopped dead. It illuminated the quiet alcove near the towering champagne fountain. It landed directly, unmistakably, on DeAndre. Kiara froze. She squeezed her eyes shut for a fraction of a second, entirely convinced the lighting technician had made a catastrophic error. The blinding beam was so intense she could feel the heat of it against her skin. A heavy, expectant silence dropped over the thousands of attendees. Every single face in the massive hall turned toward them. Kiara looked up at DeAndre, waiting for him to step out of the glare, waiting for security to correct the mistake. He did not move away. He stood perfectly centered in the blinding light. A slow, incredibly calm smile spread across his handsome face. He turned his broad shoulders toward her. The rented tuxedo suddenly looked like bespoke armor. He reached down and took her trembling hand in his. He lifted her fingers to his lips, pressing a warm, lingering kiss against her knuckles. "I will be right back," DeAndre murmured, his deep voice carrying a terrifying, wonderful weight. He released her hand. He reached down and smoothly buttoned his tuxedo jacket. He turned away from the alcove and stepped forward. The crowd instantly parted for him. Billionaires and industry legends stepped backward, clearing a wide, unobstructed path to the main stage. DeAndre did not rush. He walked with the heavy, measured, unstoppable stride of an apex predator claiming its territory. He moved through the sea of the global elite as if he owned every single breath they took. Kiara watched him go, her mind fracturing into 1,000 impossible pieces. The warehouse worker, the man who came home with grease on his hands, the man who sat at their broken kitchen table and ate cheap takeout while she cried over her lost career. He was walking up the velvet-lined stairs of the main stage. The heavily armed security guards flanking the podium snapped to strict attention as he passed. The announcer bowed respectfully and handed him the microphone. At the exact moment DeAndre gripped the edges of the lucite podium, the heavy gilded doors at the far end of the ballroom violently burst open. The Sterling family shoved their way inside. They were a complete humiliating disaster. Reginald's bespoke suit was damp and wrinkled from the freezing rain. Beatrice's mink coat was matted, her hair plastered against her skull. Chloe looked like a drowned rat, her designer gown clinging awkwardly to her shivering frame. Terrence was hyperventilating, his eyes bloodshot and frantic. They had spent the last hour screaming at event coordinators, threatening lawsuits, and finally leveraging a desperate mid-level connection just to get through the back service entrance. Reginald smoothed his ruined lapels, his chest heaving. He glared out over the dark ballroom, his predatory eyes searching for the stage. He had come to grovel to the savior of his company. He had come to throw Terrence to the wolves and secure the thermal components from the Aegis Micro CEO. Terrence wiped the cold rain from his eyes and looked toward the spotlight. His jaw went entirely slack. He grabbed his grandfather's arm, his fingers digging into Reginald's wet sleeve like eagle talons. "Grandfather!" Terrence choked out, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched squeak. Look at the stage." Reginald ripped his arm away and narrowed his eyes against the glare. He saw the broad shoulders. He saw the dark, commanding features. "That is the warehouse boy!" Beatrice gasped, her voice shrill with outrage. "That is Kiara's husband. What is he doing up there? Did he sneak past the guards?" Terrence was practically vibrating with a mixture of horror and sudden desperate hope. If the dock worker had hijacked the stage, security would arrest him right now. Terrence's bribery recording would die with the man's credibility. He waved his hand frantically, silently urging the guards to tackle the imposter. But no one moved. The elite crowd stood in absolute reverent silence. DeAndre leaned into the microphone. His voice rumbled through the state-of-the-art sound system, dark, rich, and vibrating with absolute authority. "Good evening," DeAndre said. "My name is DeAndre Vance. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Micro. A collective appreciative murmur rippled through the crowd. In the back of the room, Terrence stopped breathing. His heart seized violently in his chest. Reginald froze, his entire rigid posture snapping like a dry twig. DeAndre did not look at them. His eyes scanned the room, finding Kiara in the darkness, offering her a single imperceptible nod, before shifting his gaze to the sea of investors and tech barons. We stand at a critical intersection in global manufacturing. DeAndre continued, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. For decades, this industry has been dominated by legacy empires built on arrogant assumptions, empires that prioritize executive bonuses over basic functional engineering. Tonight, I want to talk to you about the reality of modern production line operation. He released the edges of the podium, pacing slowly across the stage, completely owning the space. Efficiency in electronic component manufacturing is not a buzzword, DeAndre stated, his tone turning razor sharp. It is a mathematical absolute. Yet we look across the market today, and we see bloated, outdated models failing spectacularly. We see conglomerates attempting to cut corners on fundamental safety protocols. We see executives overriding brilliant engineers to save a fractional percentage on procurement. Every single journalist in the room raised their recording devices. They knew exactly where this keynote was heading. Let us discuss thermal load limits, DeAndre said, his voice dripping with lethal precision. When a company attempts to run next-generation virtual reality hardware through an antiquated production line operation, the stress points are immediate. You cannot substitute specialized thermal shielding alloys with standard silicon capacitors. The microtolerances are simply too tight. When you ignore the fundamental architecture of a motherboard, when you ignore the power draw and the thermal load, your equipment does not just fail, it catches fire. A loud collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. The whispers erupted like wildfire. He was dissecting the Sterling tech catastrophe live on stage. He was broadcasting their exact humiliating failure to the entire global market. He was utilizing the very metrics and structural formulas Kiara had drafted to completely dismantle her former employers. These legacy companies, DeAndre continued, his voice rising, cutting through the whispers with ruthless power, believe they can bully the supply chain. They believe they can mismanage their own engineering departments, fire their most brilliant minds, and then demand miracles from their suppliers. They believe they can send incompetent middle managers to bribe warehouse foremen to cover up their catastrophic failures. Terrence let out a strangled, whimpering sound. The air completely left his lungs. DeAndre was not just the CEO. DeAndre was the man in the diner. The CEO of Aegis Micro had personally sat across from him in a greasy booth and recorded him offering a $5 million illegal kickback. Terrence backed into the heavy mahogany doors, his hands gripping his hair, his mind spiraling into total oblivion. Aegis Micro does not tolerate incompetence, DeAndre declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. We do not supply companies that disregard basic equipment maintenance and modern production line operation efficiency. We do not do business with frauds. The era of the arrogant legacy empire is officially over. Tomorrow morning, Aegis Micro will announce a complete, global embargo on all components destined for Sterling Tech. The ballroom exploded. The press corps scrambled frantically, shouting questions, their cameras flashing in a continuous blinding wave. Investors grabbed their phones furiously, texting their brokers to dump every single share of Sterling stock before the market opened on Monday. The noise was deafening, a roaring tidal wave of industry-shaking news. Kiara stood by the champagne tower, tears of absolute awe and fierce, vindicated joy stinging her eyes. The man she loved had not just protected her. He had systematically dismantled the people who destroyed her life, and he had done it on a global stage. At the back of the room, the execution was absolute. Reginald Sterling stared at the stage, his face the color of wet ash. The man they had mocked, the man Beatrice had insulted, the man Terrence had tried to arrest, was the sole gatekeeper of the world's technology supply chain. He was the phantom billionaire, and he had just publicly executed the Sterling legacy. Reginald tried to take a step forward, but his legs simply refused to hold his weight. His knees buckled completely, sending the mighty patriarch crashing down onto the wet marble floor. Chloe dropped to her knees beside him, her chest heaving as she started hyperventilating, completely unable to process the absolute destruction of her inheritance. The man they ridiculed held their company's life in his hands. DeAndre stepped back from the lucite podium. He did not smile. He did not acknowledge the frantic flashing of camera bulbs or the shouted questions from desperate tech journalists fighting against the security perimeter. He simply turned away from the microphone and descended the velvet-lined stairs of the main stage with the exact same unhurried, predatory grace he had used to enter the room. The crowd of global elites parted for him instantly. They practically fell over themselves to clear a path, their faces painted with a mixture of absolute awe and primal fear. He had just executed a multi-billion-dollar corporate empire with a few sentences. He was the apex predator of the technology sector, and everyone in the grand ballroom understood that their survival depended on his goodwill. The heavy silence was broken only by the frantic tapping of smartphone screens as fortunes were rapidly shifted. Kiara stood near the champagne fountain, her emerald silk gown catching the golden light of the chandeliers. Her heart hammered against her ribs with a fierce, triumphant rhythm. She watched DeAndre walking toward her, his broad shoulders easily navigating the sea of venture capitalists. When he reached her side, he did not say a word. He simply placed his large, warm hand on the small of her back, anchoring her, reminding her that they were a united front. They had won. The Sterling legacy was officially dead. On the far side of the ballroom, near the gilded entrance doors, Reginald Sterling scrambled up from the wet marble floor. His perfectly tailored tuxedo was a ruined, soggy mess, dripping icy rainwater onto the pristine carpet. His silver hair clung awkwardly to his skull, completely stripped of its usual intimidating volume. The patriarch of the Sterling Empire had spent his entire life projecting an image of untouchable supremacy. He had demanded absolute obedience, crushing anyone who dared to question his authority. He had built his reputation on being the most ruthless man in any room. But now, staring across the massive hall at the man who held the absolute power to dismantle his life's work, Reginald abandoned every single ounce of his pride. Panic, raw and unfiltered, hijacked his nervous system. If Aegis Micro embargoed their supply chain tomorrow morning, Sterling Tech would plunge into immediate insolvency. Their stock would flatline before the opening bell. Their creditors would call in massive unpayable debts. The board of directors would personally strip Reginald of his assets and throw him into the street. The legacy he had ruthlessly protected would turn into dust. He could not allow that to happen. He refused to lose his empire to a man he had dismissed as a laborer. Reginald lunged forward. His hands shook violently as he grabbed Terrence by the collar of his expensive rain-soaked suit. "Get up!" Reginald hissed, his voice a guttural, desperate snarl that cut through the ambient noise. "Get up right now, you pathetic fool. You are going to fix this. You are going to get on your knees and beg for our company." Terrence choked, clawing blindly at his grandfather's iron grip. His face was devoid of blood, his eyes wide with stark, unadulterated terror. "Grandfather, let go of me. He has the recording. He is going to send me to federal prison. We cannot go over there." "You will go to prison!" Reginald roared, spit flying from his lips as he shoved his grandson violently forward. "But first, you are going to save my company." Reginald gripped the fabric of Terrence's collar, twisting it viciously, and began physically dragging the young executive through the crowded ballroom. The spectacle was instantly horrifying and mesmerizing for the surrounding elite. The titans of industry, the men and women who had previously feared Reginald Sterling and courted his favor, now looked at him with undisguised disgust and profound pity. They stepped aside, whispering sharply behind their crystal champagne flutes as the ruined patriarch hauled his weeping grandson across the floor. Beatrice Sterling trailed behind them, her face buried in her heavily manicured hands, entirely unable to process the public humiliation. She staggered in her ruined heels, her wet mink coat dragging heavily behind her. Chloe stumbled alongside her mother. The reality of losing her unlimited credit cards, her luxury vehicles, and her high society status slammed into her brain with devastating force. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she practically ran to keep up with her grandfather. Reginald finally breached the inner circle of executives. He shoved past a group of European software developers and stumbled directly into the clearing where Kiara and DeAndre stood. The patriarch did not posture. He did not issue commands. He collapsed forward, his soaked knees hitting the polished marble floor with a heavy, humiliating thud. He dragged Terrence down beside him, forcing the young man into a bowing position. "Mr. Vance!" Reginald choked out, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. He stared up at DeAndre, completely ignoring the flashing cameras of the press corps closing in around them to capture the historic downfall. "Please, I am begging you. You cannot do this to Sterling Tech. You cannot place an embargo on our components. It will destroy everything I have built. My entire life is in that company. We need those motherboard shipments. I will pay double your standard rate. I will pay triple. Just please retract your statement. I will do whatever you want." DeAndre looked down at the groveling billionaire with absolute unyielding apathy. His face was a mask of carved granite projecting the supreme authority of a king observing a traitor. He did not say a single word. He simply let Reginald sit there in his wetsuit, surrounded by the mocking stares of his former peers. Chloe saw DeAndre's impenetrable silence and completely broke down. She let out a loud, hysterical sob and lunged forward. She bypassed DeAndre entirely and threw herself toward Kiara. Her arms outstretched, she attempted to pull her banished half-sister into a desperate, clinging hug. "Kiara!" Chloe wailed, fresh tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup and mixing with the rainwater. "My brilliant sister, please, you have to help us. You know how much we love you. We are family. We have always been family. You are the smartest person I know. Please tell him to give us the components. I always knew you were a genius. We were just so stressed out before. We did not mean what we said. Please forgive us." Kiara took a sharp, deliberate step backward. She raised her hand, physically blocking Chloe from making contact. The emerald silk of her gown rustled sharply in the quiet alcove. She looked at her hysterical half-sister with a cold, analytical detachment that mirrored DeAndre's icy glare. "Do not touch me, Chloe," Kiara stated, her voice carrying the lethal precision of a surgical scalpel. "You do not have a brilliant sister. You have a stray cat who belongs in the gutters. Those were your exact words outside the venue. Stand back." Chloe recoiled as if she had been physically struck, covering her mouth to muffle another loud, ugly sob. She collapsed onto the floor next to her mother, completely defeated. Terrence was shaking uncontrollably on his knees. He looked up at DeAndre, his arrogant sneer completely gone, replaced by the pathetic whimpering of a cornered coward facing his own destruction. "I am sorry," Terrence babbled, his hands raised defensively in a gesture of absolute surrender. "I did not know who you were. I swear I did not know you were the CEO. I would never have spoken to you that way if I knew you were in charge. I thought you were just a worker. Please do not ruin my life. I am begging you." DeAndre shifted his gaze. He looked at Terrence with absolute ice. The temperature in the immediate vicinity seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I believe you said working with poor people soils the hands of the elite," DeAndre stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the background noise of the ballroom like thunder. "Aegis Micro is simply protecting your delicate hands from our components." Terrence let out a strangled, breathless cry. "No, please, I was just making a joke. It was a misunderstanding. You know how corporate talk is." "It was not a misunderstanding," a new powerful voice declared. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a sharp charcoal suit stepped out from the shadows directly behind DeAndre. It was Jamal, the actual Aegis Micro Director of Operations. He held a sleek, high-tech tablet in his hand. He looked down at Terrence with a mixture of dark amusement and total disdain. "Mr. Vance tasked me with reviewing the integrity of our potential partners," Jamal announced, addressing the surrounding crowd of executives, investors, and journalists. "Aegis Micro conducts rigorous security assessments. When Mr. Sterling here attempted to bypass our safety protocols, he did not realize he was dealing with the most secure infrastructure in the world. Jamal tapped a single icon on his tablet screen. He had already wirelessly linked his device to the Waldorf Astoria's primary audio system. The soft ambient noise of the ballroom was instantly muted. Instead, a sharp, clear audio recording blasted through the massive speakers overhead, vibrating through the crystal chandeliers. Every single person in the grand hall could hear Terence Sterling's arrogant, condescending voice echoing from the ceiling. "I am offering you $5 million right now to authorize the immediate release of those thermal regulators." The recorded voice of Terence sneered, filling the entire room with the undeniable sound of corruption. "I do not care about your safety parameters. I do not care about your thermal load limits. Just sign the paperwork and take the cash. You are a warehouse worker. You will never see this kind of money again in your miserable life." The audio continued broadcasting Terence insulting DeAndre, insulting the working class, and explicitly detailing a federal crime. The reaction from this crowd was instantaneous and devastating. Gasps of horror erupted from the venture capitalists. The journalists furiously typed notes documenting the absolute proof of corporate bribery. The board members of competing tech firms shook their heads in utter disbelief. Terence had not just failed. He had broadcast his own criminal activity to the Department of Justice, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the entire global market. Terence curled into a tight ball on the floor, covering his ears with his hands, wishing the ground would swallow him whole. He was going to federal prison. There was no escaping it. The recording was undeniable, played in front of the most influential witnesses on the planet. Reginald Sterling realized that begging DeAndre was completely futile. The CEO of Aegis Micro was unmovable, an impenetrable fortress of corporate justice. The patriarch's frantic, calculating mind searched for a final desperate loophole. He needed an insider. He needed someone who could manipulate DeAndre Vance. He needed the one person he had spent the last 2 months systematically trying to destroy. Reginald violently scrambled on his knees, turning away from DeAndre and throwing himself directly at Kiara's feet. He grabbed the hem of her emerald gown, his knuckles white with panic. "Kiara," Reginald pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic, ragged sob. He looked up at the granddaughter he had banished, his eyes wide with absolute terrifying desperation. "Kiara, please, you have to save us. You are a Sterling. Your blood is my blood. I was wrong. I was terribly, terribly wrong to fire you. Terence lied to me. He manipulated the data. I did not know the truth." Kiara stared down at the man who had ordered her termination, the man who had laughed while she was thrown out of her own laboratory by armed guards. She did not move a single muscle. "I will give you everything back," Reginald begged, his voice growing louder, more frantic as the reality of his total destruction loomed over him. "I will restore your inheritance immediately. I will put it in writing tonight. I will make you the chief executive officer of Sterling Tech. You can have my office. You can have the entire board of directors fired. You can have your title, your shares, your laboratory. I will give you anything you want to save this family." Kiara looked down at the man who had banished her. Reginald Sterling, the terrifying architect of her childhood nightmares, was practically weeping on the polished marble floor. His knuckles were white as he gripped the fabric of her dress. He was broken, reduced to a hollow shell of desperate greed. She shifted her gaze past him. She looked at her grandmother, Beatrice, who had mocked her mother's poverty and ridiculed Kiara's existence. Beatrice was sitting in a puddle of rainwater, her aristocratic mask completely dissolved into a portrait of absolute horror. She looked at Chloe, the sister who had tried to destroy her, who had laughed as security guards dragged Kiara out of the corporate laboratory, was now sobbing violently, her makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. Finally, Kiara looked at Terence. The golden boy of the Sterling Empire was curled in a fetal position, rocking back and forth, entirely neutralized by the public broadcast of his own criminal arrogance. They were all staring at her, waiting for a lifeline, waiting for the unconditional family loyalty they had spent a lifetime weaponizing against her. They expected her to fold. They expected her to save them because they believed they were inherently superior, inherently deserving of rescue. Kiara reached down. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely calm. She grabbed Reginald's trembling wrists. With steady, unyielding strength, she peeled his fingers off the emerald silk of her gown. She let his hands drop back to the floor. She took a single definitive step backward, severing the physical connection between them forever. Kiara smiled coldly. She looked directly into her grandfather's frantic, bloodshot eyes. "You told me I had no inheritance." Kiara stated, her voice carrying the lethal, crystal-clear precision of absolute victory. "You were right, because tomorrow Sterling Tech will officially default. The board will oust you. And when your stock hits pennies on the dollar, Aegis Micro will acquire your remaining assets. I do not need your inheritance, grandfather. I am just going to buy your company." Reginald stopped breathing. The blood drained from his face so rapidly he looked like a corpse. His jaw worked silently, trying to form words, trying to issue a command or a threat, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The reality of his absolute destruction slammed into him with the force of a freight train. He had not just lost a contract, he had lost his entire dynasty to the granddaughter he had thrown away. Chloe let out a piercing, hysterical scream, throwing her hands over her face as the truth settled over the doomed family. Beatrice slumped forward, burying her face in her wet mink coat, completely overcome by the sheer magnitude of their public ruin. DeAndre stepped forward, his massive frame shielding Kiara from the collapsing remnants of her former family. He did not offer Reginald a single glance of pity. He extended his arm toward Kiara, his eyes warm and filled with profound, unwavering respect. Kiara looped her hand through his arm. They turned their backs on the Sterling family. The moment they pivoted away, the invisible barrier holding back the press corps shattered entirely. The swarm of journalists, photographers, and industry bloggers descended upon the ruined patriarch and his weeping family like a pack of starving wolves. Flashbulbs erupted in a blinding, continuous strobe light, capturing every angle of Reginald Sterling kneeling in a puddle on the ballroom floor. Reporters shouted questions over each other, demanding statements about the federal bribery charges, asking Terrence for a comment on his impending arrest, and demanding to know how Reginald planned to survive the morning market crash. The noise was deafening, a chaotic symphony of corporate death, but Kiara and DeAndre did not stop to watch the execution. They walked away arm in arm, gliding down the grand hallway of the Waldorf Astoria. They moved with perfect synchronization, leaving the screaming, weeping, disgraced family to be devoured by the consequences of their own actions. The heavy, gilded doors of the VIP lounge closed firmly behind them, shutting out the frantic noise of the past and opening up to a limitless future. 6 months later, the morning sun poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the top floor of the newly rebranded Aegis Micro Tower. The space had once belonged to Reginald Sterling, but the oppressive dark mahogany paneling and the heavy leather furniture were completely gone. The corner office had been entirely redesigned. It was now a masterpiece of sleek modern architecture, flooded with natural light, featuring clean lines, brilliant white walls, and sprawling glass surfaces. It did not look like a monument to old money. It looked like the command center of a global innovator. Kiara sat at the center of the room behind a sprawling custom-built architectural desk. She wore a sharp, tailored ivory suit, her dark hair pulled back into an elegant knot. She was completely absorbed in the glowing digital display embedded in the glass surface of her workstation. She expertly dragged her fingertips across the screen, rotating a complex, three-dimensional holographic rendering of a next-generation motherboard. She was reviewing the new electronic component schematics, finalizing the revolutionary thermal array she had theorized months ago in a cramped, freezing tenement apartment. The designs were flawless. They were light years ahead of anything the legacy corporations were producing, and by the end of the fiscal quarter, they would be distributed across the entire global supply chain. The heavy glass door of the office swung open. DeAndre walked into the room. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that highlighted his commanding athletic build. He carried 2 steaming cups of artisanal coffee, moving with the easy, powerful grace that demanded respect in every boardroom he entered. He was no longer playing the part of a warehouse foreman, but he still carried the grounded, authentic strength of a man who knew exactly how the world worked from the ground up. He walked up behind Kiara's chair and set a coffee cup on the edge of her desk. He leaned down, placing a large, warm hand on her shoulder. He looked at the glowing schematics on the screen, his eyes scanning the brilliant engineering work. "The Asian market's just closed," DeAndre said, his deep voice vibrating with quiet satisfaction. "The acquisition of the final Sterling manufacturing plant in Taiwan is officially complete. We have successfully absorbed all their remaining infrastructure. The transition is seamless. You own the entire board, Kiara." Kiara smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that lit up her entire face. She reached up, resting her hand over his. "We own the board," Kiara corrected him smoothly. "The engineering is only as good as the supply chain that delivers it." DeAndre chuckled, a rich, warm sound that filled the bright office. He leaned over her shoulder, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her cheek. He straightened up, looking out the massive windows at the sprawling city skyline stretching out below them. They stood together at the pinnacle of the industry. They were the ultimate power couple, a brilliant engineer and a visionary logistics titan, ruling the massive, undeniable empire they had built together directly from the ashes of the one that had foolishly discarded them.